The wind came down like a blade slicing through pine and timber as snow twisted violently across the ridge. December 1881 had brought the harshest winter the Colorado mountains had seen in decades. Snow piled in drifts taller than a man, and the cold cut straight to the bone. Garrett Sullivan tracked the wounded buck through this unforgiving landscape, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated in the howling wind. 5 years of solitude had taught him to move like a ghost through these mountains. The deer's trail was growing fainter with each passing minute as the snowfall intensified, but Garrett's eyes missed nothing. He paused, crouching to examine a peculiar pattern in the snow. What had seemed like the staggering path of a wounded animal now revealed something entirely different. Bright crimson drops stained the pristine white, too bright for animal blood that had been exposed to the cold this long. Human blood. Garrett's hand instinctively moved to the hunting knife at his belt. Years of war had taught him caution above all else. He followed the blood trail, now alert for dangers beyond the storm. The tracks led him over a small ridge and down toward a cluster of pines. That's when he saw her. A woman lay half buried in snow, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something. Her cloak, once fine but now tattered, was soaked through. Even from a distance, Garrett could see the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the fabric. Pregnant and far along from the look of it. His military instincts warred with his doctor's training. This could be a trap, but the snow around her showed no other footprints, and the blood trail was consistent with someone struggling alone through the wilderness. Garrett approached cautiously, rifle ready. "Ma'am." She didn't move. He knelt beside her, setting his rifle within reach. Gently, he turned her face toward him. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her early 30s, with auburn hair escaping from beneath a wool cap. Her skin was pale as the snow around her, save for the bluish tinge of her lips. As he checked for a pulse at her neck, her eyes fluttered open, startlingly blue and filled with terror. Her hands shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let them find me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Who?" Garrett asked, but her eyes had already closed again, her grip loosening. The wound on her shoulder became visible as her cloak shifted, a bullet wound partially frozen over. Someone had shot her and left her to die in the wilderness. Garrett glanced at the darkening sky. The storm was worsening by the minute and night would fall soon. If he left her, she wouldn't survive until morning, neither would the child she carried. Decision made, he secured his rifle across his back and carefully lifted the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected despite her condition. The cabin was nearly 2 miles away, and the snow was deepening with every passing minute. "Hold on," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just hold on." The cabin stood like a fortress against the storm, its windows glowing with the faint light of a banked fire within. Garrett had built it himself after the war, each log placed with the precision of a man determined to create something that would endure. It wasn't large, a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a bedroom, and the added surgery room where he kept his medical supplies. By the time he kicked the door open, the woman was shivering violently in his arms, a good sign despite her discomfort. It meant her body was still fighting. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the fireplace, quickly adding logs to build up the flames. The fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows across the wooden walls, lined with shelves of books, dried herbs, and medical supplies. Garrett removed his snow-covered coat and gloves, revealing hands that told their own story, the right mottled with burn scars from a battlefield explosion, the left bearing the precision and steadiness of a surgeon. A long scar ran from his temple down his left cheek, a souvenir from Gettysburg that pulled slightly at the corner of his eye. Working methodically, he gathered what he needed from his surgery bandages, needle and catgut for stitching, herbs for infection, laudanum for pain. The bullet would need to be removed quickly. He cut away the frozen fabric around her shoulder wound with practiced efficiency. The bullet had entered clean, but hadn't exited, lodged somewhere inside. He checked her for other injuries, finding only minor cuts and extensive bruising. Whoever had done this hadn't been trying for a clean kill. They'd wanted her to suffer. The woman moaned softly as consciousness returned. Her eyes opened wild with panic and confusion. "Be still," Garrett said, his voice low and calm. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up, eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where?" "My cabin. Found you half frozen in the snow." He held up a small bottle. "This is laudanum. I need to remove that bullet, and it's going to hurt." She stared at him, assessing, then gave a small nod. "The baby?" I'll be careful, he promised, measuring out the dose precisely mindful of her pregnancy. This is just enough to dull the worst of it. I need you awake enough to tell me if anything feels wrong with the child. She accepted the medicine, grimacing at the bitter taste. While waiting for it to take effect, Garrett noticed something unusual about her hands. They bore calluses inconsistent with a typical lady's life. These were the hands of someone familiar with weapons. The pads of her fingers and the base of her thumb showed the telltale marks of someone who regularly handled firearms. Whoever this woman was, she was no ordinary traveler caught in a storm. I'm going to start now, he said, holding up the forceps. Try to stay still. Her eyes locked with his, resolute despite the pain. I've endured worse. The bullet extraction was mercifully quick, Garrett's hands working with the efficiency born from years of battlefield medicine. The woman bit down on a folded leather strap, muffling her cries. Not once did she look away or close her eyes, watching his every move with an intensity that spoke of more than just concern for her treatment. When he finally dropped the bloodied bullet into a metal pan, with a soft clink, she released a shuddering breath. You've done this before. She observed, her voice strained but steady. Field surgeon, Confederate Army. He began cleaning the wound. 5th Virginia Infantry. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or wariness. But she said nothing more as he stitched the wound closed with neat, precise sutures. After bandaging her shoulder, Garrett helped her into a sitting position, propped against a chair near the fire. He draped a thick woolen blanket around her shoulders and handed her a cup of hot broth. Drink, slowly. She accepted the cup with slightly trembling hands. Thank you. What's your name? He asked, packing away his medical supplies. She hesitated, the cup halfway to her lips. Abigail, she finally said. Abigail Harmon. Garrett Sullivan. He studied her face for any reaction to his name, but saw none. How far along are you? Her free hand moved protectively to her rounded belly. 8 months, give or take a week. And the father dead. The word fell between them like a stone. My husband died 6 months ago. Garrett nodded, not pressing further. Everyone had their secrets in these mountains. His entire life here was built around keeping his own past buried. That storm's not letting up tonight, he said, moving to stoke the fire. You'll stay here. The bedroom's yours. I'll take the chair. I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition. It's common sense. His tone left no room for argument. You need rest, and that child needs its mother alive. Abigail studied him over the rim of her cup, her gaze thoughtful. Why are you helping me, Mr. Sullivan? Garrett's scarred hand flexed unconsciously as memories threatened to surface. A battlefield hospital tent, screams of dying men, a young woman clutching a baby to her chest as fever ravaged them both. He pushed the images away. This cabin's been my refuge, he said finally. Suppose it can be yours for a while. She seemed to accept this, sipping her broth in silence. Later, after helping her to the bedroom and ensuring she was settled, Garrett sat before the fire, turning the extracted bullet between his fingers. Standard Army issue. Not a hunter's round, not a common civilian caliber. Whoever had shot Abigail Harmon had military connections. Outside, the storm raged on wind, howling like lost souls around the eaves of the cabin. But for the first time in years, Garrett Sullivan was not alone with his ghosts. 3 days passed before Abigail could stand without assistance. The bullet wound was healing clean, but she remained weak from blood loss and exposure. Despite this, Garrett often found her attempting small tasks, straightening the blankets on her bed, organizing his scattered books, even trying to prepare tea when she thought he wasn't watching. You'll tear those stitches, he warned, catching her reaching for a high shelf. She lowered her arm, a flash of frustration crossing her face. I'm not accustomed to idleness. Neither am I, he replied, taking down the tin of coffee she'd been reaching for. But I've learned patience. The mountains teach that, if nothing else. As he prepared the coffee, he was acutely aware of her studying him, his movements, the layout of the cabin, the weapons hanging near the door. Always assessing, always alert. It was the behavior of someone hunted. How long have you lived here? She asked, easing herself into a chair at the small wooden table. 5 years. Since the end of '76. A long time to be alone. Garrett shrugged. I prefer it to the alternative. And what's that, people? The word contained multitudes, disappointment, betrayal, loss. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Yet here I am. Here you are, he agreed, setting a steaming mug before her. Though not by choice, yours or mine. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving a world transformed by snow. The morning sun sparkled across the pristine white landscape, nearly blinding in its intensity. It would be several days before the trails were passable, but Garrett knew he needed to make the journey to Summit Falls soon. Supplies were running low, and now he had 2 mouths to feed, soon to be 3. I need to go to town, he said, watching her reaction carefully. My nearest neighbor is 10 miles away. Are you well enough to be left alone for a day? Abigail's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her mug. I'll manage. There's a loaded rifle beside the bed. Do you know how to use it? She met his eyes steadily. Yes, he nodded, unsurprised. I'll leave tomorrow at first light. Should be back by nightfall. That evening, as Garrett prepared supplies for his journey, Abigail sat by the fire, one hand absently stroking her rounded belly. The firelight cast her face in gold and shadow, softening the wariness that seemed her constant companion. Your child, Garrett said quietly. Boy or girl? I don't know. Her expression gentled. Though sometimes I dream it's a girl. And her name? Abigail looked surprised at the question, as if she hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. I haven't decided, she said after a moment. My mother's name was Elizabeth. My husband liked Catherine. Garrett nodded, continuing his preparations in companionable silence. He was checking his snowshoes when Abigail spoke again. Mr. Sullivan. Garrett, he corrected. No one had called him Mr. Sullivan since before the war. Garrett. His name sounded different and her voice softer somehow. Thank you for not asking questions. He glanced up, meeting her gaze across the room. Everyone deserves their secrets, Mrs. Harmon. Abigail, she returned, the faintest smile touching her lips. That night, Garrett sat longer than usual before the dying fire, cleaning his revolver with practiced motions. The woman sleeping in his bed was running from something or someone dangerous enough to hunt a pregnant widow through a mountain snowstorm. Whatever trouble followed her would eventually find its way to his door. He checked the chamber of his revolver, the familiar weight of it comforting in his scarred hand. He had left war behind, but it seemed war had not entirely left him. Summit Falls sprawled in the valley below, a collection of wooden buildings and smoking chimneys nestled against the mountainside. Once a mining town, it had survived the bust by positioning itself as a supply point for travelers and the scattered homesteaders in the region. Garrett visited rarely, only when necessity demanded it. The main street was thick with churned mud and slush as he rode in his gelding, picking its way carefully between the worst of the ruts. A few townsfolk nodded in recognition, but none approached. In 5 years, he had made it clear he wasn't interested in conversation or community. Martha Wilson's general store sat at the heart of town, its weathered sign creaking in the cold breeze. Unlike most establishments, Martha's store welcomed everyone, former blue and gray alike, miners, trappers, and the occasional traveler passing through. In a town still nursing wounds from a war officially ended 16 years ago, Martha's neutrality was both uncommon and valuable. The bell above the door jangled as Garrett entered, stamping snow from his boots. The store was warm and smelled of coffee, tobacco, and the dried herbs that hung in bunches from the rafters. Behind the counter stood Martha herself, a small woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Garrett Sullivan, she said, adjusting her spectacles. Thought you might have frozen to death up there. Not yet, he replied, unwinding the scarf from around his neck. Spring order's not due for 2 months. Must be important to bring you down that mountain in this weather. Garrett set his list on the counter. Running low on some things. Martha scanned the paper, one eyebrow rising slightly. Liniment bandages, laudanum. Someone injured. Me, he lied smoothly. Old wound acting up. She made a non-committal sound, clearly not believing him, but wise enough not to press. As she gathered his supplies, Garrett browsed the shelves, adding items to his usual order: extra coffee pour, a bolt of soft flannel cloth. Expecting company? Martha asked when he placed these on the counter. Just stocking up. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, but she continued totaling his purchases. $11.42. As Garrett counted out the money, Martha leaned closer, her voice dropping. You should know there have been strangers in town, asking questions. Garrett kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. What kind of questions? About a woman. Pregnant, they said. Might have gotten lost in the storm last week. Martha's gaze was pointed, offering a sizable reward for information. Lot of women in these parts, Garrett replied carefully. Not many 8 months along, wandering these mountains in winter. Martha wrapped his purchases in brown paper. These men claim to be family worried sick, but they're carrying a lot of hardware for concerned relatives. Garrett nodded slightly, understanding her warning. Anything else I should know? Martha glanced toward the window, then reached beneath the counter. She slid a folded newspaper across to him. Came in yesterday's mail coach. The Denver Post headline jumped out immediately. Senator's wife abducted. Reward offered. Below was an engraved portrait of a woman Garrett recognized instantly, despite the formal styling and elegant dress. Abigail, except the caption named her as Mrs. Adelaide Preston, wife of Senator Theodore Preston. Thought you might find it interesting reading, Martha said neutrally. Garrett folded the newspaper and tucked it inside his coat. Much obliged. Those men checked in at Murphy's boarding house, she added. 4 of them led by a big fellow named Crane, Victor Crane. The name struck Garrett like a physical blow, though he kept his face impassive. Victor Crane had been a Union Army scout with a reputation for tracking deserters and for the condition those deserters were typically found in afterward. If Crane was involved, this was far more dangerous than a domestic dispute. Appreciate the information, Garrett said, gathering his packages. Martha nodded, then hesitated. Garrett, whatever you've gotten yourself into, be careful. Preston has powerful friends all through the territory. I always am. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. You still have that book, the one about... He gestured vaguely. Martha's eyes softened in understanding. Women's matters I do. She reached beneath the counter again and produced a worn volume titled The Midwife's Guide to Childbirth and Infant Care. Add it to my bill, Garrett said, taking the book. Outside, Garrett secured his purchases to his saddle, mind racing. He had given shelter to the missing wife of a U.S. senator, a woman who claimed to be a widow named Abigail Harmon. Either she was lying or something far more complicated was unfolding. He was about to mount when he spotted them across the street, 4 men exiting the saloon led by a towering figure he recognized immediately. Victor Crane hadn't changed much in 16 years. Still built like a bullhead, shaved clean with a network of scars visible on his neck above his collar. The kind of man who enjoyed inflicting pain. Garrett turned away, pulling his hat lower. As he swung into the saddle, he caught Crane surveying the street, eyes narrowed against the glare of sun on snow. For a moment, Garrett thought those cold eyes lingered on him, but then Crane turned away, saying something to his companions. Garrett rode out of town at an unhurried pace, aware of being watched. Only when Summit Falls disappeared behind him did he spur his horse to greater speed. The woman in his cabin had a lot of explaining to do. Abigail stood at the window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the trail that led down the mountain. The cabin felt different in Garrett's absence, both emptier and somehow more confining. She had explored as much as her strength allowed, noting exits, weapon supplies. Old habits that had kept her alive. Her shoulder throbbed dully beneath its bandage, a constant reminder of how close she'd come to failure. The child within her kicked strongly, as if sensing her distress. It's all right, she murmured, placing a hand over the spot. We're safe for now. But for how long? Senator Preston's reach was long, his resources vast, and Victor Crane never failed to find his quarry. Abigail moved to the small desk where Garrett kept paper and pencil. She had begun several letters during the day, only to discard each one. How could she possibly explain who would believe her word against that of a respected senator? The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing. She moved quickly to the bedroom, retrieving the rifle Garrett had left her. By the time the door opened, she stood in the main room, weapon not quite pointed at the entrance, but ready to be raised in an instant. Garrett stepped inside, snow-dusting his coat and hat. His eyes went immediately to the rifle in her hands, then to her face. Planning to shoot me on my own threshold, he asked mildly, closing the door behind him. Abigail lowered the rifle. Force of habit. Seems we need to discuss what kind of life gives a woman those kinds of habits. He shrugged off his coat, hanging it by the door. Then he reached inside his shirt and withdrew a folded newspaper, tossing it onto the table between them. Along with why the wife of Senator Theodore Preston is hiding in my cabin under a false name. The color drained from Abigail's face. For a moment, she looked as she had when he'd found her in the snow, vulnerable, hunted. Then something hardened in her eyes, a steel core revealing itself. "What else did you learn in town?" she asked, her voice steady. "That Victor Crane is looking for you, oh. 4 men with him." Garrett began in unpacking his supplies movements deliberate. "That there's a substantial reward for information on your whereabouts." "Are you planning to claim it?" Garrett paused, looking up at her. "If I was, I wouldn't have come back alone." Some of the tension left her shoulders. She set the rifle aside and sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "I suppose I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," Garrett replied, "but the truth might help me keep us both alive if Crane comes calling." Abigail touched the newspaper fingers, tracing the engraved image of her face. "Most of what you see here is a lie," she said quietly. "The name, the abduction, all of it crafted by Theodore to maintain his reputation. And the truth," she met his gaze steadily. "I wasn't abducted, I escaped." Garrett pulled up a chair across from her. "From what? A prison disguised as a marriage." Abigail's hand moved to her belly. "Theodore Preston is not this child's father, though he planned to claim it as his own. When I discovered his intentions to take my baby immediately after birth and send me to an asylum, I fled. And the gunshot wound? One of Preston's men caught up with me near Silverton. I managed to get away in the storm." A grim smile touched her lips. "He fared worse than I did." Garrett studied her face, looking for deception, but finding only resolute determination. "Why would a U.S. senator want to claim another man's child?" "Political expediency. The story of a senator and his young wife expecting their first child plays well with voters." Her expression darkened. "But there's more. The real father knew things. Dangerous things about Preston and his associates. Things they killed him to keep quiet. And now they want to ensure his child never learns the truth," Garrett concluded. Abigail nodded. "Among other reasons." Garrett rose, moving to stoke the fire. His mind worked through the implications, the dangers. Harboring a fugitive, especially one wanted by someone with Preston's influence, was practically suicide. The smart move would be to send her on her way as soon as she was strong enough to travel. And yet, he turned back to find Abigail watching him, her face calm, but her eyes revealing her understanding of his dilemma. She was preparing herself for rejection, for being cast out. "You have no reason to believe me," she said softly. "I've brought danger to your door and lied about who I am. I'll leave in the morning." "No." The word emerged more forcefully than he'd intended. "No," Garrett's scarred hand flexed unconsciously. "I've seen what Crane does to those he hunts. I won't send you back to that or to a man who would imprison his wife and steal her child." Relief washed over her face, quickly followed by wariness. "Why would you risk yourself for a stranger?" Garrett was silent for a long moment, memories surfacing that he usually kept buried. A crowded hospital tent, the cries of a woman in labor echoing through the night, a tiny bundle that never drew breath. "I couldn't save my wife and daughter when they needed me," he said finally, the words feeling pulled from some deep wounded place. "I was 1,000 miles away fighting in a war that took everything from me. By the time word reached me of the fever outbreak, it was too late." He looked down at his scarred hand. "I've carried that failure for 8 years. I won't add another." Abigail's expression softened with understanding. She rose from her chair and approached him, stopping just within arm's reach. "Then we help each other," she said. "You shelter me until the child comes, and I—" She glanced around the cabin. "I earn my keep however I can." "Deal," Garrett agreed, something easing in his chest for the first time in years. That night, as snow fell softly outside and the fire burned low in the hearth, Garrett sat alone at his desk, the midwifery book open before him. In the bedroom, Abigail slept or pretended to. He could feel the weight of the choice he'd made, the danger he'd invited by deciding to protect her. From the desk drawer, he withdrew a small daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. A woman with dark hair and gentle eyes smiled back at him, a small bundle cradled in her arms. Eleanor and little Sarah, taken just 3 weeks before the fever, took them both. "I couldn't save you," he whispered to the image, "but maybe I can still do something right." He closed the book and extinguished the lamp, but remained sitting in the darkness, watching the dying embers cast their faint glow across the room. For the first time in years, Garrett Sullivan felt something stir within him, something he'd thought long dead. Purpose. Turn. Days melted into weeks as January tightened its grip on the mountains. The snow lay deep and unchanging, transforming the landscape into a vast white stillness, broken only by the occasional deer trail or the tracks of passing wolves. Inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Abigail, gaining strength daily, had begun to put her mark on the space. The disorganized shelves were now neatly arranged, the floor swept clean, the windows cleared of grime to let in the winter light. She had discovered Garrett's small collection of books and organized them by subject, added her touch to the simple meals they shared, and even mended his threadbare shirts with neat, precise stitches. For his part, Garrett found himself speaking more than he had in years. At first, their conversations were practical discussions of supplies, whether her healing wound. But gradually, other topics emerged. She asked about his medical training, his knowledge of the mountains. He inquired about her life before Preston, discovering she had served as a nurse during the latter years of the war. Union or Confederate, he had asked, expecting the former, given her connection to Preston. Union, she confirmed. Field hospital outside Richmond, last year of the war. We might have crossed paths without knowing it. Perhaps. Something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was saying, but Garrett didn't press. They developed routines. Mornings, Garrett would check her wound, pleased with its healing. Then he would attend to outside chores, chopping wood, checking his traps, tending to the horse. Abigail would prepare a simple breakfast and spend the morning on indoor tasks, resting when her body demanded it. Afternoons often found them sitting near the fire, Abigail sewing or mending, while Garrett read aloud from one of his books. Sometimes they spoke of the war, sharing sanitized versions of their experiences. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts. Evenings brought a different kind of intimacy, planning for the child's arrival. Garrett had begun constructing a small cradle from pine boards, his large hands surprisingly deft with the fine work. Abigail prepared what she could, folding small garments fashioned from one of Garrett's old shirts, creating swaddling cloths from soft flannel. They never spoke of what would happen after the birth, whether she would stay or move on, how long his protection could last. Such questions hung between them, acknowledged but unaddressed. One evening, as a gentle snowfall dusted the window panes, Abigail sat by the fire while Garrett worked on the cradle. The rhythmic sound of his sanding filled the comfortable silence between them. "My father was a carpenter," Abigail said suddenly. "He could coax the most beautiful things from ordinary wood." Garrett looked up, surprised by the personal revelation. "Where was home?" "Ohio, small town called Millfield." A soft smile touched her lips. "He made my mother a rocking chair when they married. Said a woman needed somewhere to rest while she changed the world." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was." Her smile faded. "The war took him at Antietam, first year of fighting." Garrett set aside his tools. "I'm sorry." She shook her head slightly. "It was a long time ago, but sometimes I wonder what he would think of the choices I've made, the path I've taken." "I think he'd be proud of your courage," Garrett said quietly. Abigail looked up, meeting his gaze across the room. Something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared loss. The moment was broken by a sharp intake of breath as Abigail's hand went to her belly. Garrett was on his feet instantly. "What is it?" "Nothing to worry about," she assured him, though her face had paled slightly. "The baby's just very active tonight." Without thinking, Garrett crossed to her side, kneeling beside her chair. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Abigail nodded. She guided his hand to the side of her rounded belly. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then a distinct movement, a tiny foot or elbow pressing outward. Wonder transformed Garrett's weathered face. It had been so long since he'd felt such a thing, the miracle of new life beneath his hands. When he looked up, he found Abigail watching him, her eyes soft with an emotion he couldn't name. "Strong," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Like her father," Abigail replied softly. The moment stretched between them, waited with unspoken things. Then Garrett withdrew his hand and rose, returning to his work on the cradle. That night, alone in his chair by the dying fire, Garrett stared into the embers and confronted an uncomfortable truth. He was growing attached to Abigail, to the unborn child, to the idea of them in his life. A dangerous weakness given the circumstances. Victor Crane was still out there hunting. Senator Preston would not simply forget his runaway wife. Sooner or later, the fragile peace they had built would shatter. And when it did, Garrett needed to be ready. February arrived with bitter winds and treacherous ice storms. Garrett made one more trip to Summit Falls, taking a circuitous route to avoid being followed. Martha warned him that Crane and his men were still searching the region, their questions growing more pointed, their methods more intimidating. "They've started offering more money," she told him, voice low though they were alone in the store. "Enough to tempt even decent folk who are struggling. Anyone talking?" "Not yet, but fear and greed are powerful motivators." Martha adjusted her spectacles. "There's more. Senator Preston himself arrived yesterday." Garrett felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "In Summit Falls," Martha nodded, "staying at Judge Holloway's house. Called a town meeting for tomorrow, offering to fund a new railway spur if the good citizens help recover his beloved wife." "How many believe him?" "More than should." Martha sighed. "But not everyone. There have been rumors about Preston for years. Whispers about his business dealings, his treatment of servants." She leaned closer. "They say his first wife died under strange circumstances, too." Garrett gathered his supplies of mind working. Preston's presence changed things. The man wouldn't have come personally unless he was closing in on his quarry. "You should leave," Martha said suddenly. "Whatever or whoever you're protecting up there, it might be time to move on." "Not yet," Garrett replied, "but soon." As he prepared to leave, Martha pressed a small package into his hands. "Iron tonic," she explained, "for whoever might need it, and this." She slipped him a folded paper. "Map of the old mining trails heading north. Some aren't on regular maps anymore." Garrett tucked both items into his coat. "Thank you, Martha." Her weathered hand caught his arm. "Be careful, Garrett Sullivan. I've buried enough good men to last 2 lifetimes." The ride back to the cabin was tense, Garrett constantly scanning for signs of pursuit. The knowledge that Preston himself was in Summit Falls created a new urgency. They needed to prepare for the possibility of flight, and soon. When the cabin came into view, relief flooded through him. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney windows, glowing with warm light against the gathering dusk. It looked like home in a way it never had before. The thought brought him up short. This wasn't home, not really. It was a temporary shelter, a way station. Once the baby came and Abigail was strong enough to travel, they would have to part ways. Shaking off the unwelcome thoughts, Garrett led his horse to the small stable attached to the cabin. As he unsaddled the gelding, a movement in the trees at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. He froze, hand moving to the rifle slung across his back. Nothing moved. The forest stood silent under its blanket of snow, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped toward the horizon. After a long moment, Garrett relaxed slightly, probably just a deer or his imagination playing tricks. Still, he approached the cabin with heightened awareness, eyes scanning the tree line. At the door, he paused, listening. From inside came the soft sound of humming a lullaby he didn't recognize. The scene that greeted him was so domestic, it made his chest ache with forgotten longing. Abigail stood at the small stove, stirring something that filled the cabin with a rich, savory aroma. She had arranged the table with more care than he ever bothered, with 2 plates, proper utensils, even a small jar with dried pine branches as a centerpiece. She looked up at his entrance, a smile warming her face. "You're back." "Just in time, it seems." He set down his packages, suddenly conscious of his snow-covered boots and unkempt appearance. "I found some dried apples and made a pie," she said, gesturing to a golden-crusted creation cooling near the window. "And stew from that rabbit you caught yesterday." "Smells good." He hung his coat, noticing she wore a dress he hadn't seen before, one of her own, that she must have mended. It transformed her from the injured fugitive he'd rescued to something else entirely. Someone who belonged here. Over dinner, Garrett relayed the news from town, watching Abigail's face pale at the mention of Preston's arrival. "We should leave," she said, setting down her spoon. "Tonight if possible." "In this weather, with you 8.5 months along," Garrett shook his head. "That's a death sentence for both of you." "Staying could be worse," she insisted. "You don't know Theodore like I do, what he's capable of." "I know Victor Crane," Garrett countered. "Tracked deserters for the Union during the war. Man enjoys the hunt almost as much as the capture." He leaned forward. "Right now we have 2 advantages. This location is remote and defensible, and they don't know for certain you're here. On the trail, we lose both." Abigail's hand moved protectively to her belly. "The baby could come any day now." "All the more reason not to risk the journey." Garrett's voice softened. "We'll prepare to leave after the birth when you're both strong enough. Martha gave me maps of old mining trails, heading north routes Crane might not know. After a moment, Abigail nodded reluctantly. How long do you think we have? A week, maybe two. Garrett reached into his coat and withdrew the package Martha had given him. Iron tonic, for your strength. Abigail accepted it with a small smile. Thank you. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence. Later, as Garrett sat down cleaning his rifle by the fire, Abigail approached with a steaming mug of coffee. I haven't been entirely honest with you, she said, settling into the chair opposite of him. Garrett set the rifle aside. I gathered as much. It's about the baby's father. She stared into the flames, hands cradled around her mug. He wasn't just any man. His name was Thomas Marshall. The name hit Garrett like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. Thaddeus Marshall had been a legend during the war, one of the Union's most effective spies, responsible for uncovering Confederate movements and supply routes with uncanny accuracy. I met him during the war, Abigail continued. I was a nurse, as I told you, but that wasn't my only role. I passed information to Union Intelligence Patient Conversations Officer, movements, supply details. Marshall recruited me. She looked up, gauging Garrett's reaction. He simply nodded for her to continue. After the war, Marshall continued his work for the government, investigating corruption and profiteering. He uncovered a group of businessmen and politicians who had enriched themselves during the conflict, stealing from both sides, manipulating markets, even prolonging fighting to increase profits. And Preston was one of them, Garrett concluded. One of the leaders, Abigail confirmed. They call themselves the Blue Circle, former officers and officials who use their positions to build fortunes and political power. How did you end up married to him? Abigail's expression darkened. Preston discovered I was working with Marshall. Instead of killing me, he saw an opportunity. Forced me to marry him as a way to control me and to keep tabs on Marshall's investigation. And Marshall, we continued our work in secret, gathering evidence against Preston and the others. We also, she faltered slightly, we fell in love. The child is his. Understanding dawned on Garrett. Preston found out. Abigail nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. 6 months ago, Marshall was found dead in his rooms, officially ruled a suicide, but no investigation. The local authorities are in Preston's pocket. Bitterness edged her voice. After Marshall's death, I discovered I was carrying his child. When Preston realized, he made plans to take the baby after birth, raise it as his heir, while committing me to an asylum. The pieces were falling into place. And the child is more than just Marshall's offspring, Garrett said slowly. It's living proof of Preston's crimes. Yes, and there's more. Abigail leaned forward, a voice dropping. Before he died, Marshall encoded the evidence he'd gathered, names, dates, transactions. He hid it in a children's rhyme. He taught me something only I would recognize. That's why Preston wants you both, Garrett said. You're the key to evidence that could destroy him and his associates. Exactly. Abigail's hand trembled slightly as she set down her mug. Now you understand why we need to leave. I've put you in the crosshairs of very dangerous men. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd revealed. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined, not just a domestic dispute or even a political scandal, but a conspiracy reaching back to the war itself. We'll leave after the birth, he finally said. Head north to Canada. I know people in Montreal who can help you disappear. Relief softened Abigail's features. Thank you for believing me, for everything. As she rose to retire for the night, Garrett remained by the fire, turning over this new information. If even half of what Abigail claimed was true, they were facing opponents far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Later, alone in the darkness, Garrett pulled out the worn daguerreotype of Eleanor and Sarah. I couldn't protect you, he whispered to their silent faces, but I swear I'll protect them. Outside, the wind moaned around the eaves of the cabin like a warning, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the rising moon. Dawn broke clear and cold, the sun casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. Garrett had risen before first light, restless after a night of troubled dreams. He stood on the porch, breath clouding in the frigid air, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. Something felt wrong, a stillness that went beyond the usual winter quiet, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Movement at the edge of the clearing confirmed his suspicions. A dark shape slipped between the trees, too large for a deer, too deliberate for a wolf. Garrett stepped back into the shadow of the doorway, hand going to the revolver at his hip. For 10 minutes he watched as the figure circled the perimeter of the clearing, careful to stay within the tree line. Scout, not shooter, assessing the cabin's defenses. When the figure finally retreated into the deeper forest, Garrett waited another 5 minutes before moving. Then he slipped back inside, closing the door silently behind him. Abigail stood in the kitchen area, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other gripping the edge of the table. Her face was pale, her breathing carefully controlled. "Someone's out there," Garrett said, moving to check his rifle. "I know," she replied, voice tight. "I saw him from the bedroom window." Garrett paused, taking in her stance and strained expression. "What's wrong?" "The baby," Abigail said, meeting his eyes. "I think it's starting." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with significance beyond their simple meaning. The child was coming, and so were their enemies. Perfect timing. "How long?" Garrett asked, shifting seamlessly from frontiersman to doctor. Contractions started during the night, mild at first. She grimaced as another one began. "Getting stronger now, still far apart." Garrett nodded, mind racing through calculations. First babies often took their time, 12 hours, sometimes 24 or more from first signs to delivery. They might have a narrow window to execute the contingency plan he'd been developing. "We need to move," he said, already gathering essentials. "There's a line shack 2 miles north. Trapper I know uses it during season. It's well hidden, stocked with basics. Can we reach it in time?" "If we leave now, yes." He began packing medical supplies, food, weapons. "The man I saw was alone, a scout. Once he reports back, more will come." Abigail nodded, understanding immediately. "They'll expect us to run south toward town or the pass." "Exactly. North leads deeper into the mountains, more dangerous terrain." Garrett handed her a heavy coat and fur-lined boots. "Most would consider it suicide in winter, especially with a woman in your condition." "Which is why it might work," she concluded, already pulling on the boots despite the discomfort of another contraction. Within 20 minutes they were ready. Garrett had packed everything they might need for the birth and immediate aftermath, along with enough supplies to last several days. The horse was saddled, their tracks swept away near the cabin to buy time. He helped Abigail onto the gelding, noting the way she bit her lip against the pain. "I'll lead on foot," he explained. "Harder to track a man on foot than a horse with two riders." The journey was slow and grueling. Garrett broke trail through knee-deep snow, leading the horse along game paths and narrow defiles where the wind had swept the ground nearly bare. Every few minutes he stopped to listen, to check their back trail. Abigail remained silent throughout, conserving her strength. Only the occasional sharp intake of breath or white-knuckled grip on the saddle horn betrayed her increasing discomfort. Midday found them deep in a pine forest, the trees so thick they created a canopy that had kept much of the snow from reaching the ground. Garrett paused, orienting himself by the weak winter sun filtering through the branches. "Not far now," he assured Abigail. "Less than a mile." She nodded, face drawn with fatigue and pain. "I can make it." Just as they prepared to continue, a distant sound froze them both, the baying of hounds, faint but unmistakable. "Tracking dogs," Garrett said grimly. "Crane's pulling out all the stops." "How much time do we have?" "Not enough." He scanned their surroundings, making a quick decision. "We need to split up." "No. Listen." His voice was low but urgent. "I'll take the horse, create a false trail south. Make them think we're both heading that way. You continue north to the line shack. It's just beyond that ridge." He pointed to a rocky outcropping, visible through the trees. "And if they catch you," Abigail's eyes were fierce with concern. "They won't." Garrett handed her his revolver. "But if anyone besides me comes through that door?" She accepted the weapon with a nod, understanding perfectly. Helping her down from the horse was difficult. Another contraction seized her just as her feet touched the ground, forcing her to lean heavily against him. For a moment they stood close, her face pressed against his chest, his arm steadying her. "Be careful," she whispered, when the pain had passed. "You too." He hesitated, then pressed something into her hand, the small daguerreotype of Eleanor and Sarah. "Keep this safe for me." Before she could respond, he swung onto the horse and rode away, deliberately crashing through underbrush, leaving an obvious trail southward. Abigail watched until he disappeared from view, then turned north, one hand on her belly, the other gripping Garrett's revolver. The line shack waited somewhere ahead, and with it, the final act of their desperate drama. Behind her, the baying of the hounds grew louder. The line shack crouched in a small clearing, half buried in snow. like a hibernating beast. It was crude but solid, a single room built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a single window covered by a wooden shutter. Abigail approached cautiously, revolver ready. The door creaked open at her touch, revealing a Spartan interior, a narrow cot against one wall, a small iron stove, a rough table with a single chair. Shelves held basic supplies, matches, lantern oil, salt coffee beans. A stack of firewood stood beside the stove, and a water barrel half full and partially frozen occupied one corner. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Abigail closed and barred the door, then moved methodically through the tasks Garrett had outlined before they separated. First, she lit a fire in the stove, feeding it small pieces until the flames caught properly. Then she melted snow for water, arranged the medical supplies on the table, and prepared the cot with clean blankets from their packs. All the while, the contractions continued growing stronger and more frequent. She worked through them, pausing only when the pain became too intense to move. Years of nursing had taught her what to expect, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. By late afternoon, the shack was as ready as she could make it. The fire burned steadily, water simmered on the stove, and blankets waited to receive the child. Abigail sat on the edge of the cot, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other holding Garrett's daguerreotype. The woman in the image looked back at her with gentle eyes, the infant in her arms barely visible beneath swaddling cloths. Eleanor and Sarah, the family Garrett had lost. The pain in his eyes whenever he spoke of them suddenly made perfect sense. Not just grief, but guilt, the special torment reserved for those who survive when loved ones perish. A particularly strong contraction gripped her, forcing a gasp from her lips. The daguerreotype slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. When she retrieved it, she noticed something she hadn't before, writing on the back, faded but legible. "My heart's treasures, until we meet again, G." Tears pricked at Abigail's eyes. How many nights had Garrett sat alone in his cabin, looking at this image, speaking to ghosts who couldn't answer? The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back to the present. She tucked the daguerreotype into her dress pocket and raised the revolver, aiming at the door. "Abigail," Garrett's voice low and urgent. "It's me." Relief flooded through her as she lowered the weapon. "Come in." He entered quickly, securing the door behind him. Snow dusted his coat and hat, and his breath came in short, visible puffs. He looked exhausted, but alert eyes immediately taking in the preparations she'd made. "Any sign of pursuit?" she asked. "Led them 5 miles south before doubling back." He removed his coat, hanging it by the door. "Lost the horse in the process, had to cut him loose when the dogs got close. They'll be busy following that trail for a while." Abigail nodded, then grimaced as another contraction began. Garrett was at her side, instantly supporting her as she breathed through the pain. "How close?" he asked when it had passed. "Maybe 10 minutes apart. Getting stronger." He nodded, already rolling up his sleeves. "Let's get you more comfortable." As dusk gathered outside, the line shack became a world unto itself, warm, close, focused entirely on the ancient primal process unfolding within its walls. Garrett moved with calm efficiency, his battlefield medical training serving him well in this different kind of battle. He helped Abigail when she needed movement, supported her when pain demanded stillness, offered water and encouragement as hours stretched into the night. His hands, scarred but gentle, checked her progress with clinical detachment that somehow never felt impersonal. "You've done this before," Abigail observed during a brief respite between contractions. "Delivered babies, I mean." A shadow crossed his face. "A few times, during the war mostly. And after—" He trailed off, but she understood. "After Eleanor." As midnight approached, the contractions intensified, coming in waves that left Abigail gasping. Garrett knelt beside the cot, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of pain. "You're doing well," he assured her. "Very close now." Outside, the wind had risen, moaning around the eaves of the shack like a lost soul. It covered the sound of Abigail's cries as the final stage began, the relentless pressure, the overwhelming urge to push. "I see the head," Garrett said, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "One more big push, Abigail." She gathered her remaining strength, bearing down with a primal grunt that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. Pain unlike anything she'd known tore through her, and then sudden, shocking relief. A moment of terrible silence followed. Then a thin, mewling cry filled the shack, the first breath of a new life. "A girl," Garrett said, his voice thick with emotion as he laid the tiny, squirming infant on Abigail's chest. You have a daughter. Tears streamed down Abigail's face as she cradled the child, red-faced, covered in birth fluids, and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Small fists waved in protest at the cold world, dark hair plastered to a perfectly formed head. Hello, little one, she whispered. I've been waiting for you. Garrett worked quietly, delivering the afterbirth, ensuring the bleeding was controlled, wrapping the infant in clean cloths. His hands moved with practiced skill, but his eyes held a distant sorrow. Memories of another birth, another child who had never grown to womanhood. When everything was settled, he sat heavily in the single chair, suddenly looking every one of his years, and then some. The night's events had taken their toll, not just physically, but emotionally. Thank you, Abigail said softly, looking up from her daughter's face. For everything. Garrett nodded, unable to speak. In the quiet that followed, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the wind outside, and the occasional snuffling of the newborn as she nuzzled against her mother's warmth. What will you name her? Garrett finally asked. Abigail looked down at the child, then back at him. Hope, she said. Her name is Hope. Something shifted in Garrett's weathered face, a softening, a release. It's a good name. I think so too. Abigail touched the pocket where his daguerreotype rested. Would you like to hold her? Surprise flickered across his features, followed by hesitation. Then he moved to the cot, sitting carefully beside her. With infinite tenderness, he took the tiny bundle in his scarred hands. Hope squirmed slightly, then settled, one miniature hand escaping the swaddling to wrap around his finger. Garrett stared down at her in wonder, throat working, as he swallowed hard. She's perfect, he whispered. Yes, Abigail agreed, watching them both with tired eyes. She is. For a brief, suspended moment, they existed in a bubble of peace, a man, a woman, and a newborn child sheltered from the storm. The threats waiting outside seemed distant and unreal compared to the miracle they had just witnessed. But reality was never far away. As if to remind them, a wolf howled somewhere in the darkness, lonely, haunting, and too close for comfort. Garrett's head came up, his expression shifting from wonder back to vigilance. Try to rest, he said carefully, returning Hope to Abigail's arms. Dawn's not far off, and we still have a long journey ahead. Abigail nodded, already feeling exhaustion pulling at her. As her eyes drifted closed, she saw Garrett move to the window, pushing the shutter open a crack to peer into the night. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the silhouette of his broad shoulders against the firelight, standing guard between her child and the dangers that lurk beyond their fragile sanctuary. Dawn broke reluctantly over the mountains, pale light filtering through the single window of the line shack. Outside, the forest stood silent under a fresh dusting of snow branches, heavy with white. No tracks marred the pristine surface the storm had covered, whatever trail might have led to their temporary refuge. Inside, Abigail stirred on the narrow cot, momentarily disoriented. The events of the previous day rushed back in a flood: the escape from the cabin, the grueling journey through snow, the hours of labor. She glanced down to find Hope sleeping peacefully against her chest, tiny face relaxed in the absolute trust of the newly born. Across the room, Garrett slept sitting up, back against the wall, rifle across his knees. Even in sleep, his face retained its watchfulness, brow slightly furrowed, as if his dreams were as vigilant as his waking mind. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened, instantly alert. How is she? He asked, voice rough from sleep. Perfect, Abigail replied softly, stroking the downy head nestled against her. How long was I asleep? About 4 hours. Garrett rose stiffly, moving to stoke the fire in the small stove. How do you feel? Sore, tired. She shifted carefully, wincing. But alive. He nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying, the gratitude, the relief, the lingering fear. I checked the perimeter at first light. No sign of pursuit, but that won't last. Crane is too good to be fooled for long. How long do we have? A day, maybe less. Garrett poured water from the melted snow into a tin cup and added herbs from his medical kit. Drink this. It will help with the pain and bleeding. Abigail accepted the bitter tea, grimacing at the taste, but drinking it without complaint. When do we leave? You've just given birth. Garrett reminded her, his doctor's instincts warring with tactical necessity. Ideally, you shouldn't travel for at least a week. We don't have a week. No. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. We don't. Hope stirred, making small mewling sounds, that quickly transformed into lusty cries. Abigail shifted to nurse her a movement both ancient and new. As the baby latched on, Abigail looked up to find Garrett studiously busying himself with preparations for breakfast, offering them privacy. This small courtesy amid their desperate circumstances touched her deeply. "It's all right," she said softly. "You've seen far more intimate parts of me during the delivery." A hint of color touched his weathered cheeks, but he nodded, continuing his work while speaking over his shoulder. "We need a plan. The line shack is secure for now, but we can't stay. North is still our best option." "Yes, there's a network of old mining trails leading to the Canadian border." Garrett set a pot of coffee on the stove. "Martha gave me maps. If we can reach the St. Mary River, there are settlements on the other side where Preston's influence won't reach." Abigail considered this, stroking Hope's cheek as she nursed. "How far? 200 miles, give or take." Garrett's expression was grim. "Normally 2 weeks travel in good conditions. And in winter with a newborn." He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. "I need to get stronger quickly," Abigail said, resolution hardening her voice. "And we need to leave as soon as possible. Tomorrow morning at the latest." Garrett wanted to argue, to insist on more recovery time, but he knew she was right. Every hour they remained increased the danger. "I'll make preparations," he agreed. "But today, you rest and regain your strength." The day passed in quiet industry. Garrett fashioned a sling that would allow Abigail to carry Hope close to her body, leaving her hands free when needed. He prepared pemmican and journey bread, dense, nutritious foods that would sustain them on the trail. From the line shack's meager supplies and their own packs, he assembled what they would need for survival in the wilderness. Abigail rested as ordered, but her mind remained active. Between caring for Hope and brief periods of sleep, she took stock of their situation with the clear-eyed assessment that had made her a valuable agent during the war. "There's something I haven't told you," she said as evening approached, breaking a long silence. Garrett looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "About Preston. About you." Abigail held his gaze steadily. "I knew who you were before I came to your cabin." The knife stilled in his hand. "Explain." "When Marshall was investigating the Blue Circle, he uncovered connections to the battlefield hospital where I worked during the war." She shifted Hope to her shoulder, patting the infant's back gently. "One incident kept appearing in reports: a Confederate surgeon who saved the life of a Union intelligence officer against direct orders." Understanding dawned in Garrett's eyes. "Thaddeus Marshall was the officer I treated." Abigail nodded. "He never knew your name, but he described you and the consequences you faced for helping him." "Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge." Garrett's voice was flat, reciting facts rather than reliving pain. "Imprisonment until the war's end." "Marshall never forgot what you did," Abigail said softly. "He said he owed his life to an enemy who showed more humanity than his own commanders." Garrett was silent for a long moment, absorbing this unexpected connection across the years. "That still doesn't explain how you found me." "After Marshall's death, when I discovered I was pregnant, I needed to disappear. I remembered his story about the Confederate doctor who saved him, a man who might understand choosing conscience over loyalty." Abigail's eyes held his. "It took time, but I tracked rumors of a reclusive surgeon living in the Colorado mountains. When I learned your location, I arranged to be hired through the mail order service. You came to my cabin deliberately." Garrett said, the pieces finally falling into place. "Not by chance." "Yes." She looked down at Hope, then back to him. "I came seeking protection from the man who had once protected Marshall, even at great cost to himself. And if I had turned you away, I would have understood." A sad smile touched her lips. "But I hoped you wouldn't." The revelation hung between them, altering the foundations of their relationship. What Garrett had thought was chance, or at most fate, had been calculation and design. "Why tell me this now?" he asked finally. "Because we're about to risk everything together," Abigail replied, "and there should be truth between us." She hesitated, then added, "There's more, about Marshall and the evidence against Preston." Garrett set aside the knife, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." "Before he died, Marshall encoded everything he'd discovered about the Blue Circle names, transactions, crimes committed during and after the war. The cipher key is hidden in a children's rhyme he taught me." Her voice softened. "He knew they might kill him, but he believed the truth would eventually come to light. And Preston knows about this evidence. He suspects but doesn't know its form or where it's hidden." Abigail's expression hardened. That's why he's so desperate to find me. Not just to silence me, but to prevent the exposure of crimes that would hang him and his associates. Garrett absorbed this understanding at last, the full weight of what they faced. Not just a jealous husband or a political scandal, but powerful men protecting themselves from justice. This evidence, can it be recreated if something happens to you? The question was blunt but necessary. Abigail appreciated his directness. No, she admitted. Marshall was thorough in his precautions. The cipher exists only in my memory, and even I don't know all that the encoded documents contain. Then keeping you and Hope alive isn't just about justice for you and Marshall, Garrett concluded. It's about justice for all those harmed by Preston and his circle. Yes, Abigail's arms tightened protectively around Hope. And it's why they'll never stop hunting us. Night fell swiftly in the mountain's darkness, draping over the forest like a heavy cloak. Garrett secured the line shack, barring the door covering the window, banking the fire to provide warmth with minimal smoke. They would need to leave before dawn, using the pre-morning darkness for cover. As they settled for a few hours of rest, Garrett found himself watching Abigail and Hope in the dim firelight. The child slept peacefully, unaware of the dangers surrounding her very existence. Abigail dozed fitfully, one hand always resting protectively on her daughter. Despite everything she had revealed, the calculation behind her arrival at his cabin, the deliberate seeking of his protection, Garrett couldn't find it in himself to resent her choices. In her position, he might have done the same. More than that, he recognized in her the same quality that had driven him to save Marshall on that blood-soaked battlefield years ago, the courage to follow conscience, regardless of consequence. Sleep eluded him as he turned their situation over in his mind. The journey ahead would be perilous under the best circumstances. With Abigail weakened from childbirth and a newborn, to protect the odds shortened considerably. Yet there was no alternative. To remain was certain death. To surrender meant the same, only slower and with more suffering. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, as Garrett kept his solitary vigil, Abigail's eyes opened. Their gazes met across the darkened room, a silent understanding passing between them. "We'll make it," he said quietly, answering her unspoken question. She nodded once, a small gesture of faith in the face of overwhelming odds, before closing her eyes again. Outside, snow began to fall once more, erasing all traces of their presence from the world. They left the line shack 2 hours before dawn, when the night was at its darkest and coldest. Garrett led the way, breaking trail through knee-deep snow, rifle ready. Abigail followed, Hope secured against her chest in the improvised sling, Garrett's revolver tucked in the pocket of her coat. The forest was eerily silent, the snow dampening even the sound of their passage. Their breath clouded in the frigid air, crystallizing on eyebrows and collar edges. The moon, just past full, cast blue-white light across the landscape, turning familiar shapes into ghostly sentinels. Progress was painfully slow. Garrett chose their path, carefully staying beneath the tree canopy where possible to minimize tracks visible from above. Every half hour he called a brief halt, allowing Abigail to rest and checking that Hope remained warm in her cocoon of blankets. The infant was remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Only occasionally did she whimper, quickly soothed by Abigail's gentle murmurings. By mid-morning they had covered perhaps 3 miles, a fraction of what Garrett had hoped for. Abigail was flagging, her face pale with exhaustion, movements increasingly stiff. Childbirth had taken its toll, despite her determination. "We need to rest," Garrett said, helping her to a fallen log partially sheltered by evergreen boughs. "I can keep going," she protested, though the relief in her eyes as she sat betrayed her words. "Not without risking collapse." He unpacked a small tin of journey bread and pemmican, offering her the most nutritious portions. "Eat, then feed Hope. We'll continue in half an hour." While Abigail ate and nursed the baby, Garrett scouted their back trail, alert for any sign of pursuit. The falling snow had obscured most of their tracks, but Crane was too experienced to be deterred by such a simple obstacle. When he returned, he found Abigail dozing, Hope sleeping contentedly at her breast. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply observe them, mother and child, vulnerable yet remarkably resilient. Something protective and fierce stirred in his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. The sound that saved them was almost imperceptible, just the faintest jingle of metal against metal carried on the still air. Garrett reacted instantly, hand covering Abigail's mouth as he pressed her and Hope flat beneath the sheltering pine boughs. "Don't move," he breathed against her ear. Riders. They lay motionless as hoofbeats approached, muffled by snow, but growing steadily louder. Through gaps in the pine needles, Garrett could make out 4 men on horseback, moving in a search pattern through the trees. At their head rode Victor Crane, massive and intimidating, on a stallion that seemed too small for his bulk. "Spread out," Crane ordered, his voice carrying clearly in the winter stillness. "They're on foot with a newborn. They can't have gone far." The men separated, each taking a different direction. Crane himself remained on the main trail, scanning the forest with predatory intensity. For a heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to fix directly on their hiding place. Beside him, Garrett felt Abigail tense, one hand curling protectively around Hope's swaddled form. The baby chose that moment to stir, making a small sound of discontent. Abigail froze, her body rigid with fear. Garrett's hand moved from her mouth to gently cover the infant's face, not blocking her breathing, but muffling any further sounds. Crane's head tilted slightly, listening. Then, to their horror, he dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men who had circled back. "Check that area," he said, pointing toward a section of forest not far from where they hid. "I thought I heard something." "Yes, sir." The rider wheeled his horse, heading directly toward them. Garrett made a split-second decision. Pressing Abigail's shoulder in a silent command to stay hidden, he slipped away through the underbrush, moving at a crouch until he was some distance from their hiding place. Then deliberately he stepped on a dry branch. The sharp crack echoed through the forest. The rider's head snapped toward the sound, as did Crane's. "There!" the rider shouted, spurring his horse in Garrett's direction. Garrett was already running, zigzagging between trees, staying low to present a difficult target. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from his head. He ducked, changed direction, and kept moving. Behind him he heard Crane shouting orders, the sounds of pursuit growing as the other riders converged on his position. Exactly as he'd intended. For 20 minutes, Garrett led them on a desperate chase through the forest, always staying just visible enough to keep them following, yet using the terrain to prevent a clear shot. His lungs burned in the cold air, legs aching from plowing through deep snow, but he pushed on, drawing them further and further from where Abigail and Hope remained hidden. When he judged they were at a safe distance, Garrett implemented the next phase of his improvised plan. Reaching a small stream partially frozen over, he followed it for several hundred yards, the water concealing his tracks. Then, spotting a low-hanging branch, he grabbed it and swung himself up into the tree. Moving from branch to branch with the agility born of desperation, he made his way through the canopy until he was well away from the stream. Only then did he drop back to the ground, immediately setting off at an angle that would eventually bring him back to Abigail, but by a circuitous route unlikely to be discovered. The forest echoed with distant shouts as Crane and his men lost the trail at the stream. Garrett allowed himself a grim smile. They would waste hours searching in the wrong direction. It took him nearly an hour to circle back to the fallen log where he had left Abigail and Hope. His heart sank when he found the spot empty, no sign of them beneath the pine boughs. Had they been discovered after all? Had Abigail fled, thinking him captured or killed? Then he saw it, a small break in the snow at the base of a nearby pine, almost invisible, unless one knew exactly what to look for. The sign they had established during their night in the line shack, 3 vertical scratches, a signal that she had moved but was safe. Following the subtle trail only another tracker would recognize, Garrett made his way deeper into the forest. He found them nearly half a mile away, concealed in a small hollow beneath a rock outcropping. Abigail's face flooded with relief when she saw him, though she remained silent, communicating her emotions through her eyes alone. Hope slept against her, oblivious to the danger they had narrowly escaped. "They've lost our trail for now," Garrett whispered, crouching beside them. "But they'll keep searching. We need to move further north before nightfall." Abigail nodded, gathering her strength. "I heard the gunshot." "Missed me by a mile," he lied, not mentioning how close the bullet had come. "Ready?" "Yes." She rose with determination, adjusting Hope in her sling. "Lead the way." They traveled until dusk, covering another 4 miles of difficult terrain. Garrett pushed them harder than he would have preferred, knowing that distance from Crane was their only advantage. Abigail never complained, though he could see the toll each step took on her still recovering body. As darkness fell, they found shelter in a natural cave formed by a rocky overhang. It was shallow but dry, and the entrance could be partially obscured with pine branches. Most importantly, it allowed for a small, nearly smokeless fire, crucial for warmth as the temperature plummeted with nightfall. You should have been a fox instead of a doctor, Abigail said as they huddled close to the tiny flames. The way you led them away from us. Standard battlefield diversion, Garrett replied, though her praise warmed him more than the fire. I've had practice evading pursuit. After your court-martial, he nodded, memories surfacing. Spent 6 months in a Union prison camp before they transferred me to a proper military prison. Escaped during the transfer. Spent the rest of the war moving between Confederate field hospitals under assumed names. Yet you kept treating patients, she observed, even after what it cost you. Garrett stared into the flames, considering her words. A surgeon's duty doesn't end because of politics or punishment. No more than a mother's duty ends because of danger. Abigail agreed, looking down at Hope's sleeping face. We do what we must for those in our care. They fell silent, each lost in private thoughts, as the fire burned low. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of another storm. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that seemed to embody their own isolation. Tell me about them, Abigail said suddenly. Eleanor and Sarah, if you don't mind. Garrett stiffened slightly, surprised by the request. Few people knew those names, and he never spoke them aloud. Yet something in Abigail's gentle tone made the question feel like a gift rather than an intrusion. Eleanor was a teacher before we married, he began, voice low. Taught at a small school near Richmond. She loved books, poetry especially. Could recite Wordsworth from memory. The words came easier than he expected, memories flowing like a long, dammed river finally breaching its barriers. Sarah was born in '63 while I was serving with the 5th Virginia. I got leave to see her when she was 2 weeks old. She had Eleanor's eyes dark blue, serious, like she was already thinking deep thoughts. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Tiny little thing. My hand could cover her whole body. When did you lose them? Abigail asked softly. Summer of '65, after Appomattox, but before I could get home. His voice roughened. Typhoid swept through Richmond. By the time I reached them, they were already gone, buried together in the church cemetery. Abigail's hand found his in the darkness, a simple human connection offering comfort without platitudes. I'm sorry. Been a long time now, he said, though the pain in his voice belied the words. Some grief doesn't fade with time, she observed. It just becomes part of who we are. Garrett nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. They sat in companionable silence, hands still joined, until Hope stirred, hungry and demanding attention. While Abigail nursed the infant, Garrett stepped outside their shelter, ostensibly to check the perimeter, but really to compose himself. The night air was sharp in his lungs, steadying him after the unexpected emotional terrain he had traversed. Above, stars glittered between racing clouds, indifferent to human struggles below. The mountains stood as they had for millennia, silent witnesses to generations of joy and suffering. Perspective, Garrett thought. In the face of such vastness, his personal pains seemed smaller, not insignificant, but perhaps more bearable. When he returned to the shelter, Abigail had finished nursing Hope and was changing the infant's swaddling cloths with practiced efficiency. Storm coming, he reported, settling back beside the fire. We should try to reach the old mining camp tomorrow before it hits. There's an abandoned cabin there where we can wait it out. How far? 6 miles, rough going, he hesitated. If it's too much. It's not, she interrupted firmly. I'm stronger than I look, Garrett Sullivan. A rare smile crossed his face. I'm beginning to see that. And they took turns sleeping that night, each watching over the other during their guard shift. During his vigil, Garrett found himself studying Abigail's face in repose, the strength evident even in sleep, the determination that had carried her through circumstances that would have broken many. He had known brave women before Eleanor had shown remarkable courage during the early uncertain days of the war, but Abigail's particular blend of vulnerability and resilience affected him deeply. She had endured betrayal, loss, and constant danger, yet still managed to create and protect new life. More than that, she had trusted him, a stranger, an enemy soldier, with both her safety and her truth. The weight of that trust settled around his shoulders like a mantle, both burden and honor. By first light, Garrett had made a decision that went beyond their immediate survival. Whatever happened in the days ahead, he would see Abigail and Hope safely to Canada, not just because it was right or because of his connection to Marshall, but because they had awakened something in him he had thought forever lost. Purpose. And perhaps, if he dared name it, hope. The mining camp appeared as a dark smudge against the white landscape, a cluster of weathered structures half buried in snow. Most were collapsed or listing dangerously victims of harsh winters and abandonment. But one cabin remained relatively intact, its stone chimney standing firm against the elements. Garrett and Abigail approached cautiously alert for any sign that others had preceded them. The undisturbed snow around the buildings was reassuring, but Garrett insisted on scouting the area thoroughly before allowing Abigail and Hope to enter the cabin. "Clear," he reported, returning from his inspection. "No one's been here in months, maybe years." The cabin's interior was dusty but dry, with a small iron stove, a crude table and frames that had once supported bunks along one wall. Miners' tools hung from pegs and rusted tins lined a rough shelf left behind when the silver vein played out and the camp was abandoned. Garrett quickly set about making the space habitable, sweeping away dust and cobwebs, checking the stovepipe for blockages, gathering what dry wood remained in the lean-to behind the cabin. Abigail helped where she could, one-handed with Hope secured against her. By midday, they had transformed the abandoned cabin into a reasonable shelter. The stove radiated welcome heat, melting snow provided fresh water, and the sparse supplies from their packs made a simple but nourishing meal. Outside, the sky had darkened, ominously heavy clouds pressing down on the mountains like a physical weight. The wind strengthened, carrying the first flakes of what promised to be a significant storm. "Good timing," Garrett observed, securing the cabin's shutters against the coming onslaught. "This one's going to be fierce." "How long will it last?" Abigail asked, settling Hope in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden storage box padded with blankets. "Hard to say. Mountain storms can blow through in hours or linger for days." He added wood to the stove, building up the fire. "Either way, we're better off waiting it out. Crane won't be tracking in this weather." As if to emphasize his words, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters and driving snow through every tiny crack in the aging structure. Within an hour, the storm had transformed into a full blizzard, the world outside reduced to a swirling white void. The enforced confinement created an unexpected intimacy. The cabin was small, the stove's warmth drawing them close together. They spoke quietly, sharing stories from before the war, memories untainted by the suffering that came later. Garrett described growing up in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, learning medicine from his father, who had been the local doctor. Abigail spoke of her childhood in Ohio, her mother's garden, her early dreams of becoming a teacher like Eleanor. "How did you become a nurse instead?" Garrett asked as he whittled a small wooden toy for Hope, a simple rattle that would someday make her laugh. "When the war came, there was such need," Abigail replied, mending a tear in her coat. "My mother had taught me herb lore and basic healing. It seemed the most useful way to serve." She glanced up, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "And I wanted adventure, if I'm being honest, to see beyond Millfield." "Did you find it adventure?" "More than I bargained for." Her expression sobered. The hospital tents were educational in ways no finishing school could match. Garrett nodded, understanding perfectly. "War makes quick teachers of us all." "Yes." Abigail set aside her mending, watching him work on the toy. "When did you know you wanted to be a doctor?" "Always," he replied without hesitation. "Earliest memory is following my father on his rounds carrying his bag. Never considered any other path." "And the war, did it change how you saw medicine?" Garrett's hands stilled momentarily. "Changed everything. Before, I thought healing was straightforward: find the ailment, apply the cure. War taught me it's messier than that." He resumed his whittling, careful strokes shaping the wood. "Sometimes you save someone only to send them back to the slaughter. Sometimes you choose who lives based on who can return to fighting soonest." "Is that why you helped marshal a rejection of those choices?" "Partly." Garrett considered his words carefully. He was unconscious when they brought him in, Union officer behind Confederate lines. "My commanding officer ordered minimal treatment, just enough to keep him alive for questioning." His jaw tightened at the memory. But he had information they wanted, and their methods of questioning. "I'd seen the results." "So you treated him fully, then helped him escape," Abigail concluded. "Seemed like the right thing at the time." Garrett's tone was matter-of-fact, without regret, despite the consequences he had faced. "Still does." Abigail studied him with new understanding. "You're a rare man, Garrett Sullivan. Just a doctor who remembers his oath," he demurred, uncomfortable with her praise. The storm intensified as night fell, wind shrieking around the cabin like lost souls. The temperature dropped sharply, frost forming on the inside of the windows, despite the stove's efforts. They moved their bedrolls closer to the heat source, creating a small island of warmth in the otherwise frigid cabin. Hope woke frequently hungry or uncomfortable in the strange surroundings. Abigail tended to her with patient devotion, singing softly as she nursed lullabies and folk songs that seemed to calm the infant, even when the storm raged at its fiercest. During one such interlude, as Abigail sang a gentle melody about meadows and streams, Garrett found himself transported to another time and place, a small house in Virginia. Eleanor's voice singing those same words to baby Sarah. The memory was so vivid it caught him off guard, a physical ache in his chest. "I know that song," he said when Abigail finished. "Eleanor used to sing it." "It's very old," Abigail replied. "My grandmother taught it to me." "Would you sing it again?" The request felt awkward on his lips, but Abigail smiled and obliged, her voice soft but clear above the storm's fury. As the familiar melody washed over him, Garrett closed his eyes, allowing memories long suppressed to surface, not with the usual sharp pain, but with a bittersweet ache that felt almost like healing. When the song ended, he opened his eyes to find Abigail watching him, her expression gentle with understanding. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Marshall used to hum that tune when he was working, said it helped him think." Her voice softened. "It's part of the cipher, actually. The melody provides the key to decoding his notes." "Clever," Garrett acknowledged. "Few would connect a lullaby to espionage work." That was Marshall's genius. He hid things in plain sight, using the ordinary to mask the extraordinary. A shadow crossed her face. "I wish you could have known him properly, I mean. Not just as a wounded soldier." "Tell me about him," Garrett suggested, recognizing her need to speak of the man she had loved. Abigail's expression lightened memories, bringing both joy and sorrow. "He was brilliant, but not in an intimidating way. Could make anyone feel comfortable, from senators to stable boys. He noticed everything, tiny details most would overlook." She spoke for nearly an hour, painting a portrait of Thomas Marshall that went far beyond the legendary spy Garrett had heard about during the war. The man who emerged from her stories was complex, principled, occasionally stubborn, with a dry wit and profound devotion to both country and the woman he loved. "He would have been a wonderful father," she concluded softly, looking down at Hope's sleeping face. "He was so excited when I told him about the baby, even though our situation was complicated. He knew before he died." "Yes, it was the last time I saw him." Her voice caught. "He made me promise to protect our child no matter what. Said the baby represented everything he was fighting for, a future free from corruption and old hatreds." Garrett nodded, understanding that perspective all too well. The war had ostensibly ended in 1865, but its aftershocks continued to shape the nation. Men like Preston and his Blue Circle associates exploited divisions and wounds for personal gain, perpetuating conflict even as they profited from supposed peace. "We'll honor that promise," he said with quiet certainty. "Get you and Hope safely to Canada, then find a way to expose Preston's crimes." Abigail looked up, surprised by the determination in his voice. If you'll allow it," Garrett amended, suddenly uncertain. "I have connections in Montreal, other Confederate expatriates who've built new lives. They can help establish you with a new identity, find safe housing." "And you?" The question hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to fully address. "One step at a time," Garrett said finally. "First, we get you across the border." Abigail accepted this, though something in her eyes suggested she had hoped for a different answer. "Yes, one step at a time." The storm continued through the night and into the following day, confining them to the cabin's close quarters. They used the time to rest, to plan, to prepare for the difficult journey still ahead. Maps were studied, routes discussed, contingencies established for various scenarios they might face. By the second evening, the storm showed signs of abating. The wind's howl diminished to a moan, then a whisper. The constant assault of snow against the shutters ceased, leaving an expectant silence in its wake. Garrett ventured outside to assess conditions, returning with frost-rimmed beard and eyebrows. But positive news. Storms passing, stars visible to the north. We should have clear weather by morning. "How deep is the snow?" "Thigh-high in places, but settling already. Cold snap coming will firm it up, make travel easier." He shed his outer layers, moving to the stove to warm his hands. "If conditions hold, we can reach the St. Mary River in 4 days. And the border shortly after," Abigail concluded, relief evident in her voice. "Yes." Garrett hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. When I checked our back trail, I found tracks partially filled by snow, but distinct. Someone's been through the mining camp recently." Abigail tensed instinctively, gathering Hope closer. "Crane? Can't be certain, but the timing fits." Garrett's expression was grim. "They lost our trail in the storm, but we're still searching the general area. We need to move at first light before they can resume tracking in earnest." The news cast a pall over the cabin, dispelling the fragile sense of security they had established. Once again, danger pressed close, a constant shadow on their path. That night, as they prepared for what might be their last hours of relative safety, Abigail made a decision. Removing the daguerreotype of Eleanor and Sarah from her pocket, she held it out to Garrett. "You should have this back," she said softly. "I've kept it safe, as promised." Garrett looked at the image of his lost family emotions warring across his weathered face. After a long moment, he gently closed her fingers back around the frame. "Keep it a while longer," he said, "for luck." Abigail nodded, understanding the significance of the gesture. She tucked the daguerreotype carefully back into her pocket next to her heart. Outside, the night sky cleared as stars, emerging one by one like distant beacons. The moon, waning now, but still bright, cast blue shadows across the new-fallen snow. In the forest beyond the mining camp, a lone wolf called to its pack, the haunting sound carrying clearly in the still air. Inside the cabin, Garrett checked their weapons one final time. His rifle, Abigail's revolver, the hunting knife at his belt. Tomorrow they would leave the relative shelter of the mining camp and strike north toward the Canadian border. Toward freedom if they were lucky, toward confrontation if they were not. As if sensing the gravity of the moment, Hope stirred in her makeshift cradle, making small sounds of discontent. Abigail lifted her, murmuring soothing words as she settled the infant against her shoulder. Garrett watched them, these two who had entered his life so unexpectedly, yet now seemed essential to it. Whatever came in the days ahead, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would give his last breath to see them safely through. Some commitments transcended duty, honor, even oath. Some bonds once formed could never be broken, not by distance, hardship, or even death itself. Eleanor and Sarah would understand, he thought. Perhaps they had even guided him to this moment, this choice. As dawn approached, Garrett and Abigail prepared in focused silence, each movement efficient and purposeful. They packed only what was essential and distributed the weight carefully to allow maximum mobility, checked and rechecked their route. The first pale light of morning found them standing at the edge of the mining camp, facing north toward uncertain terrain and an uncertain future. Hope slept peacefully in her sling against Abigail's chest, oblivious to the dangers surrounding her young life. "Ready?" Garrett asked, rifle slung across his backpack, secure. Abigail nodded, her eyes clear and determined. "Ready." Without further words, they set off across the pristine snow, two figures and a tiny third moving steadily northward as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and promise. Behind them, the abandoned mining camp stood silent, already erasing evidence of their brief presence. Ahead lay miles of wilderness, a river crossing, and the border that represented their best hope for safety. And somewhere in between, Victor Crane and his men continued their relentless hunt. Summit Falls dozed under a blanket of fresh snow, its streets quiet in the late afternoon lull. The storm had passed, leaving the town transformed into a winter postcard, smoke curling from chimneys, icicles hanging from eaves, children's snowmen standing guard in front yards. At the center of town, Judge Holloway's house stood apart from its neighbors, larger and more refined, with columns flanking the entrance and actual glass in all its windows. A pair of armed men stood on the porch, despite the cold, their presence announcing the importance of the visitor within. In the judge's study, Senator Theodore Preston stood before the fireplace, a glass of brandy in one hand, his face a mask of controlled fury. At 58, Preston cut an impressive figure, tall, solidly built with silver hair and beard, meticulously groomed to project an image of distinguished authority. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, cold, calculating, with the predatory focus of a man accustomed to power. "Incompetence," he said flatly, addressing the man who stood at attention before him. "That's the only explanation for this continued failure, Mr. Reed." Thomas Reed, Preston's personal secretary, and the liaison between the senator and Crane's tracking team, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, the storm." "Don't speak to me of weather," Preston cut him off. "I pay Crane an exorbitant sum precisely because he claims to be capable of tracking in any conditions. Yet a woman 8 months pregnant has somehow eluded him for weeks. 9 months now, sir, Reed corrected, then immediately regretted it as Preston's gaze sharpened dangerously. Yes, 9 months. Preston set down his glass with deliberate control, which means the child has likely been born, a complication I specifically instructed Crane to prevent. Reed swallowed nervously. Mr. Crane believes they're heading north, sir, toward the Canadian border. He's sent word requesting additional men and resources to cut them off. Of course they're heading north, Preston snapped. It's their only logical choice. And yes, provide whatever Crane requires. But make it clear I expect results, not excuses. He turned back to the fire, his voice lowering. The woman and child must be recovered. Quietly, permanently. And the man with them. The mountain recluse. Preston's expression darkened further. Eliminate him. He's seen and heard too much to be permitted to live. Yes, sir. Reed hesitated, then added, there's one more thing you should know. Martha Wilson at the general store, she's been asking questions. About your wife, about your business affairs. The senator was silent for a long moment, flames reflecting in his cold eyes. Is that so? Perhaps it's time I paid Mrs. Wilson a personal visit. Reminder of the benefits of discretion. As you wish, sir. Reed recognized his dismissal and backed toward the door. I'll inform Crane of your instructions immediately. When Reed had gone, Preston remained before the fire contemplating the flames, with the detached calculation that had served him well throughout his rise to power. The situation was growing more complicated by the day threads unraveling from what should have been a tightly controlled narrative. Abigail's escape had been unforeseen but manageable, a temporary embarrassment that could be explained away. Her death in the wilderness would have been tragic, but ultimately convenient, closing the Marshall chapter permanently. But now, with the child born and both mother and infant still at large, the threat had evolved. If Abigail reached Canada with Marshall's offspring and the encoded evidence, everything Preston had built over 2 decades could collapse. The Blue Circle itself, the shadowy alliance of former officers, politicians, and industrialists who had profited immensely during and after the war, would be exposed. Fortunes would be lost, reputations destroyed, prison terms, or worse, awaiting those implicated. Preston had not come this far, sacrificed so much to allow a dead spy's lover and bastard child to undo it all. Picking up his brandy glass, he drained the remaining liquid in a single swallow, feeling the familiar burn down his throat. Then, decision made, he crossed to the judge's desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. The telegram he composed was brief but clear, addressed to associates in Washington who maintained connections with certain specialized operatives, men whose services were never officially acknowledged, but frequently utilized by those in power. If Victor Crane failed in his task, these men would not. Either way, Abigail Harmon and Thomas Marshall's child would never reach the Canadian border alive. Preston sealed the telegram, a cold smile touching his lips. Chestnut checkers, that had always been his approach. Multiple pieces, multiple moves, all advancing toward a single inevitable conclusion. Checkmate. Morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the temperature having plummeted overnight. The world sparkled in crystalline perfection, sunlight fracturing into prisms as it struck ice-coated branches. Their breath formed thick clouds that hung suspended in the still air before slowly dissipating. Garrett led the way, using a fallen branch as a walking stick to test the snow's depth. The cold snap had formed a crust strong enough to hold his weight in most places, making their progress swifter than expected. By mid-morning, they had left the mining camp far behind, following a narrow game trail that wound through dense pine forest. Abigail followed steadily, hope bundled securely against her chest. The infant had settled into a rhythm of sleeping during their travels and waking during brief rest periods, almost as if she understood the necessity of their silent progress. How much farther to the river? Abigail asked during one such rest as she nursed Hope beneath the shelter of a spreading hemlock. Garrett consulted Martha's hand-drawn map. About 12 miles, 2 days at our current pace. He glanced at the sky, assessing the weather. Clear conditions should hold, but the cold will deepen tonight. Abigail nodded, adjusting Hope's swaddling to better protect her from the biting air. Despite the challenges of their journey, she looked stronger with each passing day, her body recovering from childbirth with remarkable resilience. They continued northward, moving through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as they approached the foothills that separated them from the St. Mary River Valley. Game trails disappeared, forcing them to navigate between rocky outcroppings and through thickets of scrub pine. The going was slow, each mile earned through persistence and careful route finding. Late in the afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the snow, Garrett raised his hand for a halt. He stood utterly still, head slightly tilted, listening. Abigail froze immediately, alert. "What is it?" "Not sure." He scanned their surroundings, eyes narrowed. "Thought I heard something." For long moments they remained motionless, ears straining against the silence. The forest held its breath around them, not even a bird call to break the stillness. Then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a branch snapping somewhere off to their left. "Move," Garrett whispered, guiding Abigail toward a cluster of boulders. "Stay low." They crouched behind the rocks, Garrett's rifle ready, as he peered cautiously around the edge. For several tense minutes, nothing moved in the forest before them. Then a shape emerged from between distant trees, a large buck, antlers branching impressively, moving with cautious dignity through the snow. Relief washed over them both. Just wildlife, not pursuit. "We're getting jumpy," Garrett said, lowering his rifle. "With good reason." Abigail's arms tightened protectively around Hope. "How close do you think Crane is?" "Too close," he admitted. "The mining camp wasn't that remote. If they picked up our trail there—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Both understood the precariousness of their position, still days from the border, burdened with a newborn, pursued by men who would not hesitate to kill them all. As twilight approached, they found shelter in a small ravine, partially covered by fallen timber. The natural formation provided protection from the wind and concealment from casual observation. Garrett constructed a lean-to of pine boughs, creating a space just large enough for Abigail and Hope to rest comfortably. "I'll take first watch," he said, settling himself at the entrance where he could observe the approach from all directions. "Wake me in 4 hours," Abigail insisted. "You need rest too." He nodded, though both knew he would likely let her sleep longer. In the gathering darkness, they shared a cold meal of pemmican and journey bread, neither daring to risk a fire despite the plummeting temperature. Hope fussed quietly, uncomfortable in the bitter cold. Abigail tucked the infant inside her coat, sharing body warmth, while Garrett arranged every available blanket to create a cocoon around them both. "She's so small to endure such hardship," Abigail whispered, stroking Hope's cheek as the baby finally drifted to sleep. "She's stronger than she looks," Garrett replied. "Like her mother." A ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. "And stubborn like her father, I suspect." Marshall was stubborn. Impossibly so. Once he decided on a course of action, nothing could dissuade him. Her expression softened with memory. "He called it determination. I called it mule-headedness." Garrett chuckled softly. "Sounds familiar." "Eleanor used to say the same about me." She was right. Abigail's eyes held his in the dimness. "It's what will get us through this. That stubbornness. That refusal to surrender." He nodded, touched by her faith in him. "Get some rest. Long day tomorrow." As Abigail and Hope slept, Garrett kept his solitary vigil, ears attuned to every sound in the night forest. The cold, deepened stars, brittle and sharp overhead in the moonless sky. His thoughts ranged ahead to the challenges still facing them, the river crossing, the final push to the border, the uncertain reception they might find in Canada. Would Preston's influence extend across that invisible line? Would they ever truly be safe? Questions without answers. Yet he could not stop his mind from circling them, planning for contingencies, preparing for the worst while hoping for better. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, as Garrett fought the insidious creep of fatigue, a sound snapped him to full alertness, a sound so faint it might have been imagination, except his instincts recognized its significance immediately. Metal touching metal, the distinctive clink of a rifle sling against a buckle. Someone was out there. Garrett froze, eyes scanning the darkness beyond their shelter. Nothing moved, yet he knew with absolute certainty they were no longer alone in these woods. With exquisite care, he reached over and placed his hand gently over Abigail's mouth. Her eyes opened instantly, fully alert with a spy's trained response to danger. He leaned close, lips nearly touching her ear. "Visitors," he breathed the word, barely a whisper. "When I move, be ready to follow." Quickly and silently. She nodded against his palm, already gathering Hope closer, securing the sling. Garrett eased toward the rear of their shelter, where he had deliberately left a small gap in the construction and emergency exit. The space was tight, but they could squeeze through if necessary. Just as he prepared to signal Abigail to move, a voice shattered the night's stillness. We know you are in there, Sullivan. Victor Crane's distinctive rumble pitched to Carrie just far enough. Come out now and maybe the woman and child live. Garrett closed his eyes briefly. Their position was compromised, their escape route potentially watched. Direct confrontation would put Abigail and Hope at unacceptable risk. He made a swift decision. Get ready to run, he whispered to Abigail, pressing his rifle into her hands. When you hear shooting, go through the back. Head northeast. Don't stop, don't look back. Her eyes widened with understanding and protest. Garrett, no. No time to argue. He squeezed her hand once, then pressed something else into it, the map to the border. Keep Hope safe. Before she could object further, he moved to the shelter's entrance, raising his voice to carry to their hidden pursuers. I'm coming out, Crane. The woman needs more time. She's nursing the baby. 1 minute, came the reply from the darkness. Then we come in shooting. Garrett used the precious seconds to ensure Abigail was positioned at the rear exit, the rifle and map secure. Their eyes met one final time, volumes spoken in that silent exchange. Then he stepped out into the open, hands raised to shoulder height, clearly visible. That's far enough, Crane's voice directed from behind a large pine 30 yards away. Where's the woman? Safe, Garrett replied evenly. What's this about Crane? Since when does the U.S. Army hunt pregnant women through the wilderness? A low chuckle answered him. This isn't Army business, Sullivan. It's personal and profitable. Crane emerged partially from behind the tree, his massive frame unmistakable, even in the darkness. Senator Preston values his privacy and his property. A woman isn't property, Garrett said deliberately, keeping their attention on him. From the corner of his eye, he saw shadows moving, at least 3 men, besides Crane, positioning themselves strategically. That's between the senator and his wife, Crane replied. My concern is collecting what I came for. He stepped fully into the open rifle, held casually but ready. Now where is she? Gone, Garrett lied smoothly. During your little speech. Probably a mile away by now. Crane's expression darkened. Search the shelter, he ordered, and one of his men moved forward cautiously. Garrett tensed, ready to create the diversion Abigail would need. His hand drifted slowly toward the revolver at his hip, a movement Crane noticed immediately. I wouldn't, the big man warned. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Maybe, Garrett acknowledged, but you'll be the first to die. The standoff stretched between them, neither man willing to back down. Behind them, the searcher reached the lean-to rifle first. Nothing here, boss, he called after a moment, and place is empty. Relief flooded through Garrett, though he kept his expression neutral. Abigail had escaped during their exchange exactly as he'd hoped. Crane's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Spread out, he ordered his men. Find their trail. She can't have gone far with an infant in this cold. You're wasting your time, Garrett said carefully, positioning himself between the searchers and the direction he hoped Abigail had taken. She knows these mountains better than you do. And you, Crane took a step closer. What's your stake in this, Sullivan? Why risk your life for Preston's runaway wife? Some things matter more than risk, Garrett replied simply. Something like recognition flickered in Crane's eyes. The doctor with principles. I remember you now, Gettysburg. You treated enemies alongside your own men. His lip curled slightly. Got court-martialed for it, as I recall. And I'd do it again, Garrett said evenly. Admirable, Crane allowed. Foolish, but admirable. He gestured with his rifle. Unfortunately, my orders concerning you are quite specific. Garrett understood his meaning perfectly. He would not leave these woods alive. His only purpose now was to buy Abigail as much time as possible, time to put distance between herself and these killers. Your men won't find her, he said, keeping Crane engaged. The senator's secrets will still come to light. Secrets. Crane's interest sharpened visibly. What exactly do you think you know enough? Garrett let the word hang between them. Enough to understand why Preston can't afford witnesses, why he's willing to kill a mother and newborn to protect himself. Crane studied him thoughtfully. The blue circle, he said finally. That's what this is about, Marshall's evidence. Garrett kept his expression carefully neutral, though inwardly he was surprised by Crane's knowledge. The tracker was more deeply involved than they had realized. You seem well informed for a simple bounty hunter, he observed. A cold smile touched Crane's face. I've worked for the senator and his associates for many years. Their interests are varied and profitable for those who serve them well, including murder. including whatever is necessary to protect what they've built. Crane's tone was matter-of-fact without remorse or hesitation. Politics and power require sacrifices, and you're just the man to make those sacrifices, Garrett said, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. With other people's lives. Everyone serves something, Sullivan. Crane shrugged. I simply chose the winning side. He glanced over his shoulder as one of his men approached. Well, trail heads northeast, the man reported. Fresh, woman moving fast but leaving clear tracks. Crane nodded, satisfied. Good. Take Jennings and follow. Carson and I will join you after we finish here. He turned back to Garrett, raising his rifle. Any last words, Doctor? Garrett tensed, preparing for his final move. If he was going to die, he would do so fighting and perhaps take Crane with him. His hand inched closer to his revolver. Actually, a new voice cut through the tension. I have something to say. All heads turned toward the unexpected interruption. A figure emerged from the trees to their right, a small woman bundled against the cold, a rifle held competently in gloved hands. Martha Wilson. Mrs. Wilson, Crane said, surprise evident in his tone. This is an unexpected pleasure, and extremely unwise. Wisdom's overrated at my age, Martha replied calmly, her rifle unwavering. Drop your weapons, gentlemen, all of you. One of Crane's men laughed. You're outnumbered, old woman. Am I? Martha's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Jacob, Daniel, show yourselves. From the surrounding forest, multiple figures appeared, weather-beaten men in hunting clothes, rifles and shotguns trained on Crane and his team. Garrett counted 7 in all, each positioned with clear fields of fire. Summit Falls hunting party, Martha explained, out-tracking that 12-point buck everyone's been talking about. Her smile was razor-sharp. Imagine our surprise when we found human predators instead. Crane's expression darkened as he assessed the new threat. His men were now clearly outnumbered, their tactical advantage lost. This is official government business, he tried. Interference will be severely punished. Is that so? Martha stepped closer, unintimidated. Strange. Judge Holloway seemed quite shocked when I showed him the telegraph from Washington denying any official involvement in your activities here. She tilted her head. Almost as shocked as when he read the evidence of Preston's wartime profiteering I've been collecting these past 5 years. Garrett stared at Martha in disbelief. The shopkeeper had hidden depths he had never suspected. You're bluffing, Crane said, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. Try me. Martha's aim never wavered. The senator's influence is already crumbling. This morning's Denver newspapers are quite interested in his unexplained absence from Washington and the unusual number of armed men in his employ. For the first time, Crane looked genuinely concerned. My men have already found the woman's trail. They'll have her before nightfall. I think not. Another familiar voice joined the conversation. From behind Martha stepped a tall, lean man in a marshal's coat badge glinting in what little light filtered through the trees. His weathered face was stern as he surveyed the scene. Victor Crane, he announced formally, you and your men are under arrest for multiple violations of federal law, including conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and interference with a federal witness. Federal Marshal, Martha explained unnecessarily, satisfaction evident in her tone. Turns out I'm not the only one who's been watching Preston and his friends these past years. Crane's expression shifted rapidly between disbelief and calculation. His eyes darted to his men, to the surrounding hunters, measuring odds that were increasingly unfavorable. Your men pursuing Mrs. Harmon have already been intercepted, the marshal continued. I suggest you surrender peacefully. Unlike you, I prefer to take my prisoners alive. For a tense moment, Garrett thought Crane might still choose violence. The big man's finger hovered near his rifle's trigger, his jaw clenched in frustrated rage. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lowered his weapon. This isn't over, he said quietly, eyes locked on Garrett. Preston has resources you can't imagine. Perhaps, the marshal acknowledged, stepping forward to relieve Crane of his rifle. But for now, his resources are rapidly diminishing. As we speak, federal agents are executing search warrants at his offices in Washington and Denver. As the hunters moved in to disarm and secure Crane's men, Martha approached Garrett, concern replacing her earlier bravado. Are you hurt? I'm fine, he assured her, but Abigail is safe, Martha said quickly. My nephew Joseph found her about a mile northeast of here. He's bringing her back now. Relief flooded through Garrett, so profound, It nearly buckled his knees. The baby, both well according to Joseph's signal. Martha patted his arm. Though I imagine they are quite cold and frightened. How did you find us? Garrett asked, still struggling to comprehend this unexpected rescue. Martha's eyes twinkled. You think you're the only Yawanid who can read tracks? I've been living in these mountains for 40 years, young man. Her expression sobered. When you didn't return from town that last time I got worried. Then Preston arrived, asking questions that weren't entirely about finding his beloved wife. You've been following us. Keeping tabs, she corrected. I had Joseph and the others watching the trails north. When Crane started gathering men for a final push, I contacted Marshal Turner. She nodded toward the lawman now supervising as Crane and his men were bound. He's been investigating Preston's activities for the Treasury Department. Garrett shook his head in amazement. All this time I thought we were alone. No one's ever truly alone, Martha said softly. Not even stubborn mountain hermits who think they want to be. Before Garrett could respond, movement at the edge of the clearing caught his attention. Joseph Wilson, Martha's burly nephew, emerged from the trees, leading someone carefully by the arm. Abigail. She looked exhausted and cold, but blessedly alive. Hope was cradled in her arms, bundled so completely that only a tiny pink face was visible. Without conscious thought, Garrett moved toward them, covering the distance in long strides. Abigail looked up at his approach, relief washing over her features. You're alive, she breathed, reaching for him with her free hand. So are you. He took her cold fingers in his, squeezing gently, then placed his other hand on Hope's bundled form. Both of you. I heard shooting, Abigail said, her voice shaking slightly. I thought, I'm fine, he assured her, and Crane won't be troubling us anymore. She glanced past him to where the tracker and his men were being secured for transport. What happened? Martha happened, Garrett said, a hint of wonder still in his voice. And apparently she has friends in high places. More like low places with high principles, Martha corrected, joining them. Marshal Turner has been building a case against Preston and the Blue Circle for years. Your evidence will finally close the net. Abigail stared at the elderly shopkeeper in amazement. How did you know about the Blue Circle? My late husband was quartermaster for the Union Army, Martha explained. He noticed discrepancies in supply requisitions. Goods paid for but never delivered, inflated prices. Mysterious shortages that always seemed to benefit certain contractors. Her eyes hardened with old anger. When he reported his concerns, he was found dead 3 days later. Official verdict, suicide. I'm so sorry, Abigail said softly. It was a long time ago, Martha replied. But I never stopped looking for the truth. When Preston became prominent after the war, I recognized his name from William's notes. A grim smile touched her lips. I've been watching him ever since, gathering whatever scraps of evidence I could find. And now you have me, Abigail said, understanding dawning in her eyes. And Marshall's encoded evidence. If you're willing, Martha confirmed, Marshal Turner has the authority to offer you protection in exchange for your testimony. Hope squirmed in her wrappings, making small sounds of hunger or discomfort. Abigail adjusted the blankets, her expression thoughtful. What about Preston himself? Garrett asked. He's still out there. Not for long, Marshal Turner answered, approaching their group. My deputies in Summit Falls are moving to apprehend him as we speak. With Crane's capture and testimony, we have enough to hold him while we process Mrs. Harmon's evidence. And if he resists, Garrett pressed, knowing the senator was unlikely to surrender quietly. Turner's expression hardened. Then he'll discover that federal marshals are authorized to use whatever force is necessary to apprehend dangerous fugitives. What happens now? Abigail asked, her voice betraying her exhaustion. First, we get you and the little one somewhere warm, Martha said practically. There's a proper cabin about 2 miles from here, belongs to Jacob's family. Once you're rested, Marshal Turner will escort you to Denver to formally record your testimony. And after that, Abigail looked uncertain, the future suddenly shifting from their single-minded focus on escape to the more complex reality of what might follow. Witness protection, Turner said. New identities, relocation to a safe location, likely still Canada, but with official sanction and support. Garrett felt a strange hollowness at these words. The goal they had fought so hard to achieve, Abigail and Hope's safety, was now assured, but through means that would take them far from his life. A necessary outcome, yet somehow not the one he had come to hope for. Abigail seemed to read his thoughts. Her fingers tightened around his, a silent question in her eyes. Before either could speak, commotion erupted from the direction of the prisoners. One of Crane's men had broken free and was running for the trees, a deputy in pursuit. Shots rang out, voices shouted warnings and commands. In the chaos, no one immediately noticed the lone rider approaching from the south, not until he emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing, rifle raised. Senator Theodore Preston had found them after all. His first shot struck the deputy who had been chasing his escaped man, dropping him instantly. His second sent hunters diving for cover, splintering bark inches from Martha's head. "Down!" Garrett shouted, pushing Abigail and Hope behind the shelter of a large pine. Martha followed, remarkably spry for her age, as more shots rang out. From their position, they could see Preston dismounting, using his horse for cover as he exchanged fire with Turner and the hunters. His face was a mask of cold fury, all pretense of civility abandoned in this final confrontation. Abigail," he shouted between shots, "I know you can hear me. This ends now." Garrett checked his revolver, 4 bullets remaining. Not enough for a protracted firefight, but perhaps enough to protect Abigail and Hope if Preston broke through the other's defense. "He's desperate," Martha observed, surprisingly calm despite the danger. "Men like Preston don't know how to lose." "He hasn't lost yet," Garrett replied grimly, watching as the senator methodically picked off one of the hunters who had ventured too far from cover. Abigail held Hope close, shielding the infant's ears from the gunfire. Her face was pale but determined. "He'll keep killing until he gets what he wants. Or until someone stops him permanently," Garrett said, the decision crystallizing in his mind. He turned to Martha. "Keep them safe." Before Abigail could protest, he was moving, staying low, using trees and rocks for cover as he circled around the periphery of the clearing. His years in the mountains had taught him stealth, and the ongoing gunfire masked any small sounds he made. Preston was focused on the main group, unaware of Garrett's approach from his blind side. 20 yards separated them, then 15, then 10. Garrett raised his revolver, taking careful aim. One shot was all he would have before Preston's attention shifted to this new threat. He steadied his breathing finger, tightening on the trigger. "Theodore Preston," Abigail's voice rang out across the clearing, freezing both men in place. She had stepped into the open, Hope clutched to her chest. "Enough." "Abigail, get back," Garrett shouted, but she ignored him, walking steadily toward her husband. Preston swung his rifle toward her, then hesitated, unwilling to shoot the one person who held the information he needed. "Smart decision," he called. "Come here now, and perhaps some of your friends will survive this day." "No more killing," Abigail replied, continuing her deliberate approach. "It's over, Theodore. The evidence is already being processed. Marshal Turner's men have your offices in Washington and Denver. Crane will testify against you to save himself." "Lies." Preston's spat through uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Nothing can be proven without Marshal's cipher, which only you possess." "That's true," Abigail acknowledged, stopping about 15 yards from him. "And I'm prepared to tell you everything I know." Garrett watched in horrified fascination, unable to intervene without putting Abigail at greater risk. "What was she doing in exchange for what?" Preston asked suspiciously. "Safe passage for my daughter and these people." Abigail's voice was steady, her gaze unflinching. "Their lives for the cipher." Preston's eyes narrowed, calculating. "You expect me to believe you'd sacrifice justice for Marshall, just to save these strangers?" "Not strangers," Abigail corrected softly. "Family. The family I've chosen." She glanced briefly toward where Garrett remained concealed, then back to Preston. "Something you wouldn't understand." The senator's laugh was harsh, disbelieving. "Family? These backwoods? Nobodies." His expression hardened. "You've lost your mind, Abigail. That or you're stalling." "I'm offering you your only chance at escape," she said evenly. "Take it or face what's coming." For a moment, Preston seemed to consider her words, rifle lowering slightly. Then his face contorted with renewed rage. "No, no more negotiations, no more games." He raised his weapon again, aiming directly at her. "The cipher. Now, or watch your precious family die one by one." To emphasize his point, he swung the rifle toward Martha, who had emerged from behind the pine tree. His finger tightened on the trigger. Garrett acted without conscious thought, stepping into the open. "Preston." The senator's head whipped around, rifle following his gaze. The moment of distraction was all Marshal Turner needed. His shot rang out from across the clearing, striking Preston squarely in the chest. The senator staggered, shock replacing rage on his features. His rifle discharged harmlessly into the ground as he dropped to his knees, then toppled sideways into the snow. Silence fell across the clearing, broken only by the soft weeping of Hope, disturbed by the sudden gunfire. Garrett rushed to Abigail, gathering her and the infant into his arms, checking frantically for any injury. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, relief making his voice harsher than intended. "He could have killed you both." "I knew he wouldn't shoot me before getting the cipher," Abigail replied, her composure finally cracking as she trembled against him. "And I knew you and Marshal Turner wouldn't let him hurt anyone else." "Faith bordering on foolishness," Martha commented, joining them with surprisingly steady steps for someone who had just faced death. "But effective, I'll grant you that." Turner approached Preston's fallen form, kicking the rifle away before checking for signs of life. After a moment, he straightened, expression grim but satisfied. "It's over," he announced. "Preston's dead." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the clearing, tension draining away, replaced by the stunned realization that their ordeal had truly ended. Crane and his remaining men were secured. The wounded deputy was being treated by one of the hunters with medical knowledge, and Preston's body lay cooling in the snow. A powerful man ultimately undone by his own corruption and arrogance. "We should move," Turner said practically. "Get everyone to shelter before dark. There's still paperwork to be done, statements to be taken." He glanced at Abigail. "And a cipher to decode." She nodded, reality settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Yes, of course." As the group began preparations to depart, Garrett found himself standing slightly apart, watching as Abigail spoke with Turner, presumably about the arrangements for her testimony and subsequent protection. Their paths were diverging, just as he had known they must. The shared journey, the bonds forged in danger and necessity, all would soon become memories, as Abigail and Hope disappeared into the government's witness protection program. It was the right outcome, the safe outcome. Yet the knowledge brought no comfort. "You look like a man attending his own funeral," Martha observed, appearing beside him with her uncanny knack for reading thoughts. "Just tired," Garrett replied, not meeting her knowing gaze. Martha's hum conveyed complete disbelief. "And I suppose that's why you haven't taken your eyes off her since Preston fell." Garrett said nothing, unable to deny the truth of her observation. "You know," Martha continued conversationally, "witness protection doesn't preclude certain arrangements, particularly for those with unique skills who might contribute to a protected witness's ongoing safety and well-being." He glanced at her sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Marshal Turner owes me several favors dating back to when I first brought Preston's activities to his attention." A sly smile touched her lips. "And I'm quite persuasive when advocating for arrangements that seem mutually beneficial." Hope stirred in the distance, her cries carrying clearly in the still air. Abigail soothed her, swaying gently as she continued her conversation with Turner. The marshal nodded, glancing briefly in Garrett's direction before returning his attention to Abigail. "Think about it," Martha advised, patting his arm. "Some journeys end where they began. Others continue on to destinations we never imagined." With that cryptic statement, she moved away to help organize the departure, leaving Garrett to his thoughts and the first tentative stirrings of something he had not allowed himself to feel in many years. Hope. The cabin was exactly as Martha had described, solid, well-maintained, with ample space for their entire party. Jacob's family used it primarily for extended hunting trips, but it was equipped with all the comforts of a permanent home proper. Beds, a large stone fireplace, a kitchen with an actual cast-iron stove. After the privations of their journey, it seemed almost decadently luxurious. Abigail sat in a rocking chair near the fire, Hope finally sleeping peacefully after a proper feeding and changing. The warmth, the safety, the simple luxury of clean clothes and hot food had worked a transformation on them both. Even the constant wariness that had become second nature to Abigail showed signs of easing. Across the room, Marshal Turner sat at a rough-hewn table with Martha and several of his deputies, discussing the logistics of transporting prisoners and securing evidence. Crane and his men were confined in a locked storeroom under armed guard, their journey to Denver delayed until morning. Garrett moved quietly around the cabin's periphery, checking windows, securing doors, unnecessary task, perhaps with so many armed men present. But habits of vigilance were not easily abandoned. His circuit eventually brought him to Abigail's side. He stood awkwardly for a moment, suddenly uncertain in this new context where danger no longer defined their relationship. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Of course, so." She smiled, the expression transforming her tired face. "You don't need to ask permission, Garrett." He settled into the chair, his large frame making the furniture seem smaller than it was. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the fires dance across the hearth. "What happens now?" he finally asked, the question that had been circling his mind for hours. Abigail glanced toward Turner, then back to Garrett. "Denver first. I'll provide my testimony to code Marshall's evidence. After that," she hesitated. "Marshall Turner says they'll relocate us. New names, new beginning. Canada still. Probably, though perhaps not as far north as we had planned." Her fingers gently stroked Hope's downy head. "Somewhere I can raise her in peace, away from the memories of all this." Garrett nodded, fighting the hollowness expanding in his chest. "You'll be safe, that's what matters." Abigail studied him, something unreadable in her expression. "And will you return to your cabin?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought beyond ensuring her safety, hadn't considered what his own life might look like afterward. "I suppose so," he said slowly. "It's home, after all." "Is it?" Her voice was soft, but the question struck him with unexpected force. "Or is it just where you've been hiding?" Garrett looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. "I'm not hiding, I'm living as I choose." "As you were living," Abigail corrected gently, for a pregnant widow showed up in a snowstorm and complicated everything. Despite himself, Garrett smiled. "Complicated is one word for it. I've had others believe me." She shifted Hope, slightly adjusting her position in the rocking chair. "Garrett, there's something I need to say about what happens next." He steeled himself, expecting gratitude and farewell, the necessary closure to their shared ordeal. "Marshall Turner has offered me a choice," she continued. "Standard witness protection, new identity relocation, complete separation from my past life. Or," she faltered, seemingly struggling with words that normally came so easily to her. "Or, Garrett prompted, curiosity overcoming his dread. "Or a modified arrangement." Abigail met his gaze directly now, one that would allow for certain exceptions to the usual protocols. Garrett's pulse quickened. "What kind of exceptions?" "The inclusion of a trusted companion. Someone whose medical skills and knowledge of remote living would be valuable assets to a woman raising a child alone in a new environment." Her voice remained steady, but a hint of vulnerability showed in her eyes. "Someone who might be ready to stop hiding from life." Understanding dawned slowly, almost reluctantly, as if Garrett's mind resisted a possibility too fragile to examine directly. "You're asking if I want to come with you," he said carefully, needing absolute clarity. "I'm asking if you want a second chance," Abigail corrected. "Not just at protecting a family, but at having one." Her expression softened. "Hope needs a father, Garrett. Someone to teach her strength and compassion and stubborn principles. Someone who would risk everything to keep her safe." The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither had dared voice during their desperate journey. Garrett found himself unable to respond immediately, emotions he had buried for years, suddenly threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. "I'm not Thomas Marshall," he said finally, the closest he could come to articulating his deepest fear that he would be a poor substitute for the man Abigail had truly loved. "No," she agreed simply. "You're Garrett Sullivan, the man who saved us both when you had every reason to turn away. The man who taught me that grace can be found in the most unexpected places." Her free hand reached for his fingers, intertwining. "I'm not asking you to replace Marshall. I'm asking if you're ready to begin something new." Hope stirred in her sleep, tiny fingers flexing against the blanket. Garrett watched the movement, transfixed by the simple miracle of new life, a life he had helped bring into the world, had fought to protect, had come to cherish as if she were his own. And perhaps in the ways that truly mattered she could be. "I don't know if I remember how," he admitted quietly. "To be part of a family. It's been so long." "We'll learn together," Abigail promised, "one day at a time." Garrett looked down at their joined hands, her slender fingers against his scarred ones, a contrast that somehow felt right. Beyond them, Hope slept peacefully, untroubled by the weighty decisions being made around her. In that moment, the path forward seemed suddenly blindingly clear. Yes, he said simply. The single word contained multitudes, acceptance, commitment, the conscious choice to step from darkness into light. Abigail's smile in response was like sunrise breaking over mountain peaks, gradual but transformative. Yes, she echoed, squeezing his hand. Across the room, Martha caught his eye and nodded, one satisfaction evident in her expression. Clearly, she had done more than merely suggest possibilities to Marshall Turner. Garrett made a mental note to thank her properly when opportunity allowed. Outside night had fallen, completely, stars emerging in the clear mountain sky. The storm that had threatened earlier had dissipated, leaving the world crystalline and still. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the journey to Denver, testimony, the complex process of dismantling Preston's criminal network, and building new lives from the ashes of the old. But tonight, in this moment, there was only peace. The peace of dangers, survived battles won, and futures reclaimed from those who would have stolen them. Hope stirred again, this time with the distinctive sounds that preceded waking. Abigail moved to adjust her position, but Garrett gently intervened. "May I?" he asked, arms outstretched. With a smile that held both trust and promise, Abigail placed her daughter in his hands. Hope blinked up at him, tiny features scrunching momentarily before settling into curious observation. Her eyes, still the deep blue of the newly born, seemed to look directly into his soul. "Hello, little one," Garrett whispered, cradling her with practiced gentleness. "I believe we have a journey ahead of us." Hope's response was a tiny yawn, and the faintest of smiles, perhaps real, perhaps imagined, but a benediction nonetheless. Outside, a wolf called to its mate across the valley, the sound carrying clearly in the winter air. Inside, before the crackling fire, three souls who had found each other against all odds and expectations began the first tentative moments of becoming a family. Not through blood or birth or legal documentation, but through the more enduring bonds of choice, sacrifice, and love freely given. A family forged in snow and danger, tempered by loss, and ultimately saved by the most unexpected grace of all, the courage to begin again. Epilogue. 1 year later, the small farmhouse stood on a gentle rise overlooking the St. Mary River, its fresh white paint gleaming in the summer sunshine. A wraparound porch offered views in all directions, the river to the east, rolling hills to the south, and the distant silhouette of mountains to the west. Around the house, life flourished in ordered abundance: a vegetable garden heavy with ripening produce, fruit trees showing the first blush of coming harvest, chickens pecking contentedly in their yard. Wildflowers grew in carefully tended beds, their colors vivid against the weathered gray of the split-rail fence that enclosed the property. On the porch, Garrett Sullivan, now known to neighbors as Thomas Grace, sat in a rocking chair of his own making, watching as Abigail, now Sarah Grace, moved among the garden rows, Hope balanced on her hip. The child, just past her first birthday, pointed excitedly at butterflies flitting between blossoms, her delighted laughter carrying clearly across the yard. Garrett's hands moved automatically, continuing their work on the small wooden horse he was carving, though his eyes rarely left the pair in the garden. After a year, the sight of them still filled him with quiet wonder. The family he had never expected to have, the second chance he had never thought to deserve. The trial of Victor Crane and the exposure of the Blue Circle had been front-page news across the nation for months. Senators, businessmen, and military officers had fallen from grace as Marshall's evidence revealed the extent of their wartime profiteering and post-war corruption. Justice, long delayed, had finally been served. Through it all, Garrett and Abigail had remained sheltered in this peaceful corner of Montana territory just south of the Canadian border. Their testimony had been given in private, their identities concealed from public record. Marshall Turner had been true to his word, ensuring their safety while allowing them to build a life together. The farm was modest but prosperous. Garrett's medical skills were valuable in this remote area, bringing in steady income and the gratitude of neighbors who had previously traveled days to reach the nearest doctor. Abigail had planted gardens, both practical and beautiful, and was teaching at the small school in the nearest town. Hope thrived in their care, growing from the vulnerable newborn of their desperate flight to a sturdy, curious toddler with her mother's auburn hair and an infectious laugh that could melt the coldest heart. They had married in a simple ceremony 6 months after arriving, with Martha Wilson, who visited regularly despite the distance, standing as witness. The gold band on Abigail's finger had replaced Preston's ostentatious diamond, just as Garrett had replaced the painful emptiness in her life. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and honest and earned through trials that had revealed the true measure of them both. The front gate creaked, drawing Garrett's attention from his carving. A rider approached up the long drive, the familiar figure of Joseph Wilson astride his bay gelding. Martha's nephew served as their occasional courier, bringing news and correspondence from the outside world. Garrett set aside his work and stood raising a hand in greeting. Abigail, noticing the visitor, gathered Hope more securely and made her way toward the house. "Morning, Doc," Joseph called, dismounting at the porch steps. "Got mail from Aunt Martha and news from Marshall Turner." "Good news, I hope," Garrett replied, accepting the packet of letters. Joseph grinned. "The best kind. Last of the Blue Circle convictions came through yesterday. 20 years hard labor for the lot of them." He removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Abigail as she joined them. "Ma'am, little Miss Hope." Hope regarded the visitor solemnly before breaking into a toothless smile and reaching for his hat. "None of that, young lady," Abigail chided, gently adjusting her daughter out of grabbing range. "Thank you for bringing the news, Joseph. Will you stay for lunch?" "Wouldn't say no to your cooking, ma'am, if it's no trouble." As Abigail took Hope inside to prepare the meal, Garrett opened Martha's letter, smiling at the familiar handwriting that filled the pages with news of Summit Falls, the continuing fallout from the Blue Circle revelations, and her own stubborn refusal to retire despite advancing years. The final paragraph caught his attention particularly. "I sometimes wonder if Eleanor and Thomas Marshall aren't looking down with approval at how things have turned out. Not the ending any of us expected, perhaps, but the right one nonetheless. You found your grace, Garrett Sullivan, just as the engraving on your mother's ring promised. Some might call it fate. I call it justice, the good kind that brings healing rather than merely punishment. Give my love to Abigail and little Hope. Tell that child her honorary grandmother expects great things from her. After all, she's the daughter of two of the most stubborn, principled people I've ever had the pleasure to know. Heaven help us all when she comes into her own." Garrett folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket as he gazed out over the land that had become home. The mountains in the distance reminded him of Colorado, but without the weight of isolation and grief that had defined his existence there. From inside came the sounds of domestic life, Abigail's voice singing a familiar lullaby, Hope's answering babble, the clatter of plates being set for lunch. Simple sounds, ordinary moments, the very things he had once believed forever lost to him. "Garrett," Abigail called from the doorway, "are you coming in?" "Just enjoying the view," he replied, turning toward her with a smile that still felt new, even after a year of rediscovering its shape. She crossed to join him at the porch railing, Hope now contentedly settled on her hip. "Thinking deep thoughts. Thinking about mercy," he said honestly. "How it finds us when we least expect it. Sometimes in a snowstorm." Abigail's free hand found his fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "Sometimes in a grumpy mountain doctor who pretends not to care." "I never fooled you for a minute, did I?" "Not once," she confirmed, eyes bright with the same spark that had captured his attention even when she lay wounded and desperate in his cabin. Hope reached for him, a now familiar demand that never failed to humble him with its simple trust. Garrett took her, easily settling her against his chest, where she immediately began playing with the buttons of his shirt. Together, the three of them stood on the porch of the home they had built, both literally and figuratively, watching as summer light played across the land that represented their second chance. Behind them lay memories of snow and danger, loss and sacrifice. Before them stretched possibilities limited only by the horizon itself. "We should go in," Abigail said after a time. "Joseph will be wondering where his lunch is." "In a minute," Garrett replied, unwilling to relinquish this perfect moment quite yet. Hope yawned against his shoulder, her morning adventures catching up with her. Soon she would nap, then wake refreshed for new explorations under the watchful eyes of parents who had traversed darkness to deliver her into light. "I love you," Garrett said simply, the words still new enough to carry weight, familiar enough to come without hesitation. "Both of you." Abigail leaned against him, completing the circle of their embrace. "And we love you. Always." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of ripening apples from the small orchard beyond the garden. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its mate, not the lonely cry of winter, but the contented sound of one who had found its home. Inside and out, in memory and promise, in the heart of a man who had once believed such things forever beyond his reach, mercy abided, as enduring as the mountains, as gentle as falling snow, as unexpected and miraculous as grace itself.